Welcome back, legends. You're at Arcane Paradox. Another incredible story awaits. Unicorn herd sends 29 purity curses on Harry in Forbidden Forest and demanded Dumbledore's trial. Subscribe and hit the bell. Let's dive right in. Chapter 1. The forest remembers. The detention slip had read 7 p.m., Forbidden Forest, report to Hagrid, and Harry had stuffed it into his robes without reading the reason why, because honestly, at this point in his life, the reason hardly mattered. He'd been here before. He'd be here again. The forest didn't particularly scare him anymore, hadn't since second year, when he'd realized that the things lurking between those trees were, on average, no more dangerous than the things lurking in the corridors of the castle above him. It was a Thursday in late October, and the air had that particular bite to it that northern Scotland saves for the moments when you've forgotten your scarf. Harry had forgotten his scarf. He shoved his hands deeper into his robe pockets and crossed the grounds at a pace that was just slow enough to be insubordinate without being slow enough to justify a second detention. Hagrid was waiting at the tree line with a lantern in one fist and an expression that was trying very hard to be stern and failing completely at it. He was wearing his enormous moleskin coat, which meant the temperature genuinely was as bad as it felt, because Hagrid didn't bother with coats until most other people were considering thermal vests. "There ya are," Hagrid said. "Thought yet forgotten." "I forgot my scarf," Harry said, which was not an answer to the question Hagrid had asked but which Hagrid accepted anyway with a sympathetic grunt and the immediate production, from some impossible pocket, of a strip of wool the size of a small carpet. "Take that. Can't have ye getting ill." He paused. "Well. I mean. Madame Pomfrey'd fix it, but still." Harry wrapped the thing around his neck twice and it still hung to his knees. "What are we actually doing tonight?" "Checking on the unicorns." Hagrid lifted the lantern and started into the trees. "Got a report from Firenze yesterday that the herd's been acting strange. Staying close together, not venturing out to the eastern meadow like usual. Wanted to take a look, make sure none of them are injured or, well." He didn't finish the sentence, and Harry didn't need him to. They'd both been here for a night that had ended with a unicorn dead and Voldemort drinking its blood, and neither of them had ever quite shaken the specific horror of that image. "Strange how?" Harry asked, falling into step beside him. "Protective, like. Circling. Firenze said it was like they were guarding something, only there wasn't anything there to guard." Hagrid shook his head. "Unicorns don't do that without reason. They're not the sort of creatures that get spooked easily, you understand. They know things. Deep things." Harry understood. He'd always had a strange respect for unicorns, the way you have a strange respect for things that are obviously operating on a level of awareness you can't quite access. They were beautiful, yes, impossibly, almost aggressively beautiful, but that wasn't the thing about them. The thing about them was the sense, when one looked at you, that it was seeing something you hadn't shown anyone else. The forest folded around them as they walked, the lantern casting a warm circle that the dark pressed against from all sides. Harry knew the path to the eastern meadow reasonably well by now, third left past the cluster of silver birches, straight on until the ground dipped, then up the shallow rise, and he followed Hagrid's enormous silhouette with the ease of someone who'd stopped being surprised by where his life kept taking him. He felt it before he saw them. It was a pressure, not unpleasant, exactly, but noticeable, like walking into a room where the atmospheric pressure has shifted slightly. A warmth that came from no external source, accompanied by a tingling in his palms that he automatically chalked up to the cold before realizing that his palms were actually perfectly comfortable inside Hagrid's enormous wool scarf. The warmth was coming from somewhere else. From somewhere ahead. They cleared the tree line into the meadow and Harry stopped walking. There were 11 of them. He'd never seen them all together like this. Normally the herd spread out across the eastern section of the forest, seen in glimpses, one or two at a time, magical apparitions at the edge of vision. But here they were assembled in the meadow's center with a deliberateness that had nothing accidental about it, their silver-white bodies luminous in the dark, their manes picking up the light from Hagrid's lantern and throwing it back doubled. The largest one, old, Harry thought, genuinely ancient, her horn longer and more deeply ridged than the others, stood at the front of the group with a stillness that was almost architectural. "There," Hagrid breathed. "See? They're all together. All of them." "Yeah." Harry's voice came out quieter than he'd intended. "Yeah, I see." He took a step forward without consciously deciding to, and Hagrid's hand came down on his shoulder, not roughly, but firmly. "Careful, Harry. When they're like this, you don't know," but the old unicorn had already moved. She took 3 steps toward Harry with a precision that made the word steps feel inadequate. It was more like the ground was rearranging itself beneath her to carry her forward, and stopped 6 feet away. Her eyes were dark gold, the color of old honey held up to a candle. They were fixed on Harry with an attention so complete it felt like being held. He met her gaze. He didn't know why that felt important, but it did. "Hello," he said, which was not the most sophisticated thing anyone had ever said to an ancient magical creature, but it felt honest, and somehow honesty seemed to matter here. The unicorn's horn tilted down, very slightly, and the tingling in Harry's palms sharpened into something more insistent, not pain, but awareness, the feeling of someone pressing their thumb against a bruise you'd forgotten you had. He put his hand out, the way he'd seen Hagrid do it, open palm facing up. "Harry, I'm not sure," Hagrid started. She touched her horn to his palm. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that magical things in Harry's life usually were dramatic. There was no explosion, no flash of light, no sound that would have been audible to anyone else. What happened was internal, and it hit Harry the way deep cold hits you, not on the surface first, but from inside, reaching outward, as if something had just taken a very precise inventory of everything he was made of and found a great many entries in the ledger that shouldn't have been there. He was aware, distantly, of his knees hitting the ground. He was aware of Hagrid shouting his name. He was aware of the other unicorns moving, not away, but closer, forming a loose circle around him with a care that was completely at odds with how frightening it should have felt to be surrounded by 11 creatures whose legs could kick a hole through a stone wall. And then he wasn't aware of very much at all. He came back to himself on his back in the grass with Hagrid kneeling beside him looking absolutely terrified, which was its own kind of alarming because it was very difficult to terrify Hagrid. "Harry. Harry, can you hear me? Blink if you can hear me. I left my umbrella at the, I can hear you," Harry said. His voice was steady, which surprised him, because the rest of him didn't feel steady at all. He felt like a room that had just been searched by someone who hadn't been particularly careful about putting things back. "I'm all right. You fell. Your legs went and you dropped, I thought." Hagrid let out a breath that was almost a word. "What happened? What did she do?" "She didn't do anything to me." Harry sat up slowly. The old unicorn was still standing 3 feet away, watching him with those gold eyes, and the rest of the herd had not dispersed. They stood in their loose ring with a patience that felt less like waiting and more like witnessing. I think she felt something. In me." He pressed his palm against his sternum, the exact spot where the internal inventory had been taken. "Something that, I don't know. Something she didn't like." Hagrid was very quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that was trying very hard to be calm, "Harry, what exactly did that feel like?" "Like being counted." Harry looked at his hand. "And the number being wrong." The old unicorn took another step toward him, and this time when she lowered her horn toward him it wasn't his palm she was reaching for. It was his chest, specifically. She stopped with the tip of her horn perhaps an inch from his sternum, not touching, and the air between the horn and his robe shimmered faintly, the way heat shimmer looks over summer pavement, except that the color was wrong. It was the color of twilight. It was the color of something old and deliberate and deeply, deeply layered. "What is that?" Harry said, very quietly, and he was talking to the unicorn, not to Hagrid, because Hagrid couldn't see what Harry was seeing. He knew that without being told. This was being shown to him specifically. The shimmer shifted, and in the shifting Harry saw something that turned his stomach in a way he couldn't entirely explain, not nausea, but the feeling that accompanies the moment you find out that something you trusted was wrong in a way it shouldn't have been possible for it to be wrong. The shimmer had layers. He could see them the way you can see the layers in deep water when the light is right, stacked, deliberate, separate from each other. Distinct. He started counting. He got to 29. Hagrid, he said, and his voice was completely flat and completely steady in the way that voices get when the brain has decided that emotional processing is going to have to wait. We need Forenza. Forenza arrived in 11 minutes, which meant Hagrid had actually run, at full Hagrid velocity through the dark forest, and Harry spent those 11 minutes sitting in the grass with 11 unicorns arranged around him and the old matriarch standing 3 feet away, and it was, objectively speaking, one of the stranger waits of his life. Which was saying something. He used the time to think. 29. The number kept landing in his mind the way a stone lands in still water, with an impact, and then rings spreading outward from it. 29 distinct somethings layered into his chest, made visible only by the horn of a unicorn old enough to know what they were. He turned the word purity curse over in his mind, because that was the phrase that had surfaced when he'd seen the shimmer, not from any class, not from anything he'd studied, but from some deeper register, the way some words carry their own definitions in the shape of the sound. Purity magic was old magic, older than Hogwarts, older than the Ministry. It dealt with the essential nature of a person, not their blood, not their body, but the deeper composition, the quality of what they fundamentally were. And a curse applied to purity magic didn't hurt you the way a hex hurt you. It shaped you. It redirected you. It put walls in places where there should have been open space, and it did it so gradually, so precisely, that you never noticed the walls were there because you'd simply learned to live within them. 29 of those. Placed in him. He wasn't angry yet. He would be. But first he needed information, the way you need to properly see a wound before you decide how to treat it. Forenza came into the meadow at a canter, and when he saw the assembled herd and Harry sitting at their center he slowed to a walk with an expression that Harry could only describe as careful. Centaurs were hard to read, they kept their faces arranged in a kind of permanent formal composure, but Forenza had spent time teaching at Hogwarts and had consequently developed slightly more human facial expressiveness, which currently was expressing something in the region of deep concern. Harry Potter, he said. He looked at the matriarch. He looked back at Harry. Something passed between him and the unicorn in the space between those looks, not words, but meaning, communicated in ways that didn't require language. His jaw tightened. I see. I don't, entirely, Harry said. Can you talk to her? Not in the way you mean. But I can hear her. Forenza moved to stand beside Harry, not between him and the matriarch, which Harry noted and appreciated. He was positioning himself as a translator, not a barrier. She has been sensing you since you entered the forest. The herd felt you from the tree line. He paused, and in the pause there was clearly more communication happening that Harry couldn't access. They have been waiting for you. She says, the herd has sensed that you carry wounds that do not bleed. She calls them Vethra, in the old language, the language that centaurs share with the creatures of this forest. Vethra means approximately, deliberate diminishments. Things taken from someone that they should have been allowed to keep. Harry's hands were resting on his knees, and he made himself keep them there instead of pressing them against his chest. 29 of them. Forenza looked at him sharply. You could count them. She showed me. When she touched my palm. He met Forenza's eyes. She wanted me to know. Another pause, another exchange he couldn't hear. The matriarch's ears moved, a precise adjustment, and the herd shifted slightly behind her, not restlessly, but like people settling in for something they've decided they're going to see through. She says yes. She wanted you to know because it is your right to know. The Vethra were placed without your knowledge or consent, and that matters to them, to the herd, because what has been done to you is a violation of natural magical law. Not the laws of your ministry. Not the laws of your school. The laws that existed before those things were written. Firenze's expression was very carefully controlled. The laws that creatures like them exist to hold. What are they asking for? Harry said. Because he could feel it, could feel that this assembling, this waiting, this deliberate witnessing hadn't been the unicorns expressing sympathy. It had been the unicorns taking a position. Firenze was quiet for longer this time. The matriarch's horn tilted once toward the castle, a movement so deliberate it could not be mistaken for anything other than indication. They are demanding, Firenze said, and the word demanding sat in the air differently than the word asking would have, a trial. For the one who placed the Vethra. Harry looked at the castle. It sat on the hill above the forest, lit in its hundreds of windows against the dark sky, enormous and familiar and suddenly slightly different shaped than it had been this morning. Do they know who it was? He asked. Yes. Do you? Firenze looked at him for a moment with an expression that held several things at once, sorrow, and something that might have been guilt of the second-hand variety, the guilt of someone who had suspected and not acted, and underneath both of those, very steady, a kind of righteous resolution. The herd has sensed the magical signature of the Vethra since you first came to this forest as a first year. They recognized it then as they recognize it now. He paused. The signature belongs to Albus Dumbledore. Harry let that land. He let it sit in the air and settle and become solid. He'd felt the shape of it coming, had felt it in the moment he'd counted the layers, because even before Firenze said the name he'd been sorting through the architecture of his own life, the strange way certain doors had always been closed at certain moments, the peculiar consistency with which his instincts had been dimmed at the precise moments when acting on them would have changed the game. He felt it land and become solid and he sat with it for several seconds. Then he stood up. He was not shaking. He was not crying. He was not performing any of the responses that this kind of revelation was supposed to produce in a 15-year-old boy who'd spent his whole life in a world that kept happening to him. He stood up from the grass with the careful deliberateness of someone deciding something, and he looked at Firenze, and he said, I need you to come back to the castle with me. Harry, I need a witness. And I need someone who can speak for the herd's demand. He brushed the grass from his robes. They've decided to pursue this. I'm not going to make them do it without me standing next to them. Firenze studied him for a moment. Behind him, the matriarch made a sound, low, resonant, something below the frequency of words, and the herd shifted again, and this time Harry could feel what the shift meant without any translation, because the herd was not dispersing. The herd was following. All 11 of them. They will accompany us to the castle grounds, Firenze said. Good, Harry said. He looked at Hagrid, who was standing at the edge of the meadow with his lantern and an expression that had moved well past terror into something quieter and more determined. Hagrid. Can you send word to Madame Pomfrey? Tell her I'm coming in and she needs to be ready. Hagrid swallowed. Ready for what? An examination, Harry said simply. The real kind. They came out of the forest at 9:30, Harry, Firenze, Hagrid, and 11 unicorns, and Harry walked with his shoulders back and his face forward in a way that had nothing to do with bravado and everything to do with the fact that he'd made a decision and his body had already received the memo. The tingling in his palms was constant now, had been since the matriarch had touched him, and he'd stopped ignoring it because it was clearly information. It felt like the magical equivalent of knowing which way is north, a directional awareness, a sense of orientation towards something that mattered. The castle's lights burned above them as they crossed the grounds, and the night air was sharp and clear and full of stars, and the unicorns' coats threw back the starlight in a way that was visible even from the castle windows, because when they were halfway across the grounds Harry became aware of faces appearing at windows. First years mostly, drawn by the movement in the dark and the strange luminescence of the herd, and then older students who'd been drawn by the first years making noise about it, and then, just before they reached the great front doors, a single window on the 7th floor, Dumbledore's study, where the light had been on and now, suddenly, was not. Harry noticed that. He filed it with the other things he was filing. Madame Pomfrey was at the entrance before he reached it, which meant Hagrid's message had been faster than Harry's walk, which meant Hagrid had definitely run again. She was in her dressing gown with a medical kit over her arm and the expression she wore when she was professionally alarmed and professionally refusing to let it show. "Mr. Potter," she said, and then looked past him at the 11 unicorns who had arranged themselves on the castle steps with the air of people who had reserved this seating and were prepared to wait indefinitely, and she said nothing further for a full 3 seconds. "Inside. Now." "Forenza needs to come," Harry said. She looked at Forenza. She looked back at Harry. "Fine. This way." The hospital wing at 10 p.m. had that specific quality of emptiness that large stone rooms get, cold, echoing, waiting. Madame Pomfrey lit the sconces with a flick and directed Harry to a bed with the efficient authority she applied to everything, and Harry sat on it and let her begin her examination without protest, which he suspected surprised her slightly. He was not generally known for enjoying medical attention. Forenza stood near the door with the careful posture of someone occupying institutional space that wasn't designed for their species. He watched without speaking. The first 3 diagnostic spells Madame Pomfrey ran produced results she clearly understood: pulse, magical core temperature, basic aura integrity, and she noted them with practiced calm. It was the 4th spell that made her hand go still. It was a deep resonance scan, the kind that Harry had vaguely heard referred to as a soul check by older students who'd had them after serious curse exposure. The wand moved in a specific pattern and the result manifested as a shimmer in the air above the patient, similar in some ways to what the matriarch had shown him in the meadow, similar enough that Harry felt something tighten in his chest when he saw Madame Pomfrey's face as the shimmer appeared. She was a woman who'd been doing this for 30 years. She'd seen cruciatus aftermath. She'd seen the results of dark curses, cursed objects, magical accidents of the kind that left permanent marks. Her face was a professional instrument, calibrated to reveal nothing that would alarm a patient without purpose. It was alarming now. "Mr. Potter," she said, in a voice that was completely level and completely careful, "have you been experiencing any unusual gaps in your decision-making? Moments where you felt as if you were about to act on something and then simply didn't?" Harry thought about it honestly. Really honestly, the way you can only be honest about something when someone has finally given you the right question to apply to a memory you'd never looked at directly. He thought about every moment he'd talked himself out of going to someone. Every moment he'd felt the edge of anger and then felt it slide away. Every moment when the obvious response to a situation had occurred to him and then receded, like a wave pulling back before it could break. "Yes," he said. Pomfrey pressed her lips together. She ran the deep resonance scan again, this time slower, and when she counted the distinct signatures in the shimmer her face did something that she very quickly controlled, but not before Harry saw it. He recognized the look. He'd seen it on Ron's face when Ron was genuinely frightened but had decided to be useful instead. "I need to ask you something and I need you to understand that your answer will determine what I am required by magical medical law to do next," she said. "Ask. Did you consent to any magical workings being placed in your core or on your fundamental magical signature in the last 14 years? Any workings of any kind, performed by anyone?" "No," Harry said. "No, I didn't." Pomfrey set her wand down on the side table with a deliberateness that was its own kind of statement. She folded her hands. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was not pity. He'd have recognized pity and resented it, but was something closer to a particular kind of professional outrage, the kind that comes from a healer looking at someone who has been hurt on their watch. "Mr. Potter," she said, "you have 29 distinct purity curse signatures layered into your magical core. Purity curses are among the oldest and most serious violations of magical law. They are classified under the Magical Being Rights Accords of 1623 as fundamental violations of personal magical sovereignty. I am a mandatory reporter under those accords." She picked her wand back up. "I will be contacting the Department of Magical Law Enforcement tonight." "Good," Harry said. She blinked. Clearly she'd prepared herself for some version of argument. "Good." "Yes." He held her gaze. "Make sure you tell them about the herd. The unicorns on the steps." They made a formal demand, Firenze said from the door, and Pomfrey turned to look at him. Under the Accords of Naturally Sovereign Magical Species, Article 7, Subsection 3, a creature herd of sufficient antiquity may formally demand legal proceedings when a breach of magical law has been committed against a being under their protection. The herd has so demanded. He paused. I am prepared to testify to this. Pomfrey stood absolutely still for 3 seconds. Then she said, in a voice slightly lower than her usual register, who placed them? Firenze looked at Harry. Harry looked at Pomfrey. We're going to need a bigger room than this, Harry said. The knock on the headmaster's office door came at 11:15, and Harry knocked it himself. He didn't send Pomfrey. He didn't wait for Firenze to do it. He walked the 7 flights of stairs from the hospital wing to the stone gargoyle with purpose and spoke the password, Fizzing Wisby, which had always struck him as an absurd level of whimsy for a door, and went up the spiral staircase and knocked on the door. Dumbledore opened it himself. He was fully dressed, which confirmed the extinguished light Harry had noticed crossing the grounds, and his expression was composed into something warm and welcoming in the way that now, with 29 signatures in his chest like a map of decisions made about him by someone else, Harry could see was a particular kind of performance. Not false, exactly. More like a frame being placed around a conversation before the conversation had started, directing where the eye would go, what it would notice, what it would accept. He was very good at it. He had always been very good at it. Harry was done being good at being directed. Harry, my boy, Dumbledore said, with the precise warmth of someone for whom warmth had become a tool so natural he'd forgotten it was a tool. I heard there was some commotion in the forest tonight. Are you all right? Madame Pomfrey has completed her examination, Harry said. He didn't walk into the room. He stood in the doorway. I have 29 Purity Curse signatures in my magical core. She's reporting it to the DMLE tonight. He watched Dumbledore's face. He watched the warmth shift, not disappear, but adjust, recalibrate, the way a skilled negotiator adjusts when an opening position lands differently than expected. The herd of unicorns currently on the front steps has formally demanded a trial under the Accords of Naturally Sovereign Magical Species. Firenze is their witness. I'm mine. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. The office behind him was full of its usual soft light and whirring instruments and portraits of sleeping headmasters, and the entire assemblage felt suddenly like a stage set, deliberately constructed, deliberately managed, even down to the ambient comfort of the lighting. Harry, Dumbledore said, and the warmth in his voice had shifted to something more careful and more genuine, the tone of someone who is setting down a particular kind of weight. I think we should talk. We will, Harry said. In front of the DMLE. I'll see you at the trial. He stepped back from the doorway. Professor McGonagall should probably know tonight. She'll want to be prepared. He walked back down the spiral staircase without waiting to see what Dumbledore's face did next. He had an image in his mind as he walked, the matriarch standing in the meadow with her horn tilted toward the castle, patient and ancient and entirely without doubt, and he held on to it, the way you hold on to a compass heading when the landscape around you stops making sense. Outside, on the castle steps, 11 unicorns stood in the cold and waited. He pushed open the great front doors and stepped out into the night air, and the matriarch turned her gold eyes toward him, and he stood in front of her with the whole of the Scottish sky above him and said, quietly, to a creature that he'd known for 4 years and never properly talked to, "They'll answer for it." The matriarch held his gaze for a long moment. Then she dipped her horn once, slowly, toward the ground, not a bow, but something older than a bow, a gesture that belonged to a language that had been old when human beings had still been arguing about whether to build in stone, and the herd shifted around her, settling, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. They weren't leaving. Harry hadn't expected them to. He sat down on the top step, pulled Hagrid's enormous scarf tighter around his shoulders, and watched the stars come out, and thought about 29, and what each one meant, and what was going to happen next. Inside the castle, he heard, very faintly, the sound of an office door closing. He didn't look back. Chapter 2, 29. The morning came in the way that bad news comes, not all at once, but in pieces, each one slightly worse than the last. Harry had slept in the hospital wing, not because Madame Pomfrey had insisted on it, though she had, but because by the time 11 o'clock had become midnight and midnight had become 1 in the morning, the idea of climbing 7 flights of stairs to the Gryffindor dormitory and lying in his bed while his dormitory mates slept peacefully above him had felt like a particular kind of cruelty he wasn't willing to inflict on himself. He'd slept on top of the covers with his robe still on and woken at 6 to grey morning light coming through the high windows, and the first thing he'd felt, before he was fully awake, was the tingling in his palms, steady and constant and no longer unfamiliar. He lay there for a moment and let himself feel it. All 29 of them, wherever they sat in the architecture of himself. He couldn't locate them individually, not without the matriarch's horn to illuminate them, but he could feel their collective presence now, the way you can feel a splinter in your finger even when you're not pressing on it. They had texture. Weight. They'd been there so long they'd started to feel like part of him, which was, he suspected, exactly the point. Curses that feel like they belong to you are curses you never think to remove. He got up, went to the window. The unicorns were still on the steps. All 11 of them, silver in the early morning light, absolutely motionless in the way that living things are not supposed to be motionless, still as carved marble and twice as permanent. 2 students, 5th years, Hufflepuffs by the look of their scarves, had stopped on the path to the greenhouses and were staring. One of them had their mouth open. Harry understood the reaction. He also didn't particularly have time for it. Hermione arrived at the hospital wing at 6:45, which meant she'd been awake since at least 6, which meant someone had told her last night, which almost certainly meant Ron had told her the moment Harry hadn't appeared in the dormitory. She came through the door with a book under one arm and the expression she wore when she'd spent hours thinking about something and was now prepared to be useful, and Harry felt a wave of affection for her so specific and so sharp it almost hurt. "Sit down," she said. "Don't argue with me." "I wasn't going to argue with you." She sat in the chair beside his bed and put the book on her knees and looked at him for a moment with her very direct brown eyes, and then she said, "Tell me what happened." "All of it. Not the version you'd tell a teacher, the actual version." So he told her. All of it, from the tingling in his palms to the count to the matriarch's demand to the knock on Dumbledore's office door. He told it cleanly and without embellishment, because Hermione didn't need embellishment, she needed accuracy, and when he finished she sat with it for 3 full seconds, which for Hermione was a long time. "Purity curses," she said. "You know what they are." "I know of them." She opened the book. It was a reference text, old, the spine held together with a reparo that had been reapplied at least 4 times. "I got this from the restricted section last night. I told Madame Pants it was for an arithmancy essay." She turned to a page that had a scrap of parchment marking it. Purity curses, also called sovereign diminishments in older texts, are, listen to this, workings applied to the fundamental magical identity of a being, designed to redirect, suppress, or alter the natural development of magical instinct, raw power, or core personality expression. They don't cause pain. They don't produce visible symptoms. They work by making you less than you would have been, in ways so incremental that the difference is never noticed because the baseline is reset with each working. She looked up. "Harry, 29 of these would mean, I know what it means. You could be significantly more powerful than anyone currently knows. Not just a bit, we could be talking orders of magnitude. Because these curses don't just cap your power, they redirect the development pathway. Every year you've been growing into a contained version of yourself." Her voice had the careful precision of someone delivering information they find genuinely upsetting. Like growing up in a room with a ceiling this high, she held her hand 3 feet above her head, when the real ceiling is up there. She pointed at the hospital wing's vaulted stone roof. Harry looked at the ceiling. "Right. Are you?" She paused. "How are you feeling about, I mean, the curses were placed by, I know who placed them. Madame Pomfrey told me." She closed the book. Her hands on the cover were very still. Harry, I need you to understand that I'm not going to defend him. I want to say that clearly, before anything else. I don't care who he is or what he's done or what his reasons were. What was done to you is wrong and I'm not going to make excuses for it. He looked at her. I know. I just wanted you to hear me say it. I heard you. He meant it. Where's Ron? Outside the door. He's been outside the door since 5:30. Madame Pomfrey wouldn't let him in. She paused. He's been trying to decide if he's angrier at Dumbledore or at the situation in general, and I think the effort is making him vibrate. Harry almost smiled. Send him in. Ron came in like a weather system, a very controlled, very deliberate weather system that had clearly rehearsed being controlled and deliberate and almost pulled it off. He sat in the chair Hermione vacated, looked at Harry with blue eyes that were doing several things at once, and said, "Right. So. What do you need?" "That's all you're going to say?" Harry said. "Well, I've got about 40 other things I could say, but they're mostly about Dumbledore and you probably already thought all of them." Ron's jaw was tight. Mum always said he was brilliant. Dad thinks he's the greatest wizard alive. He looked at his hands. I'm not particularly, I'm not sure brilliant and good are actually the same thing, are they? No, Harry said. They're not. Right. Ron looked up. So. What do you need? This was why Ron was Ron, Harry thought. Not because he was simple, he wasn't, whatever the castle seemed to think, but because he had an extraordinary talent for identifying the operational question when everything else was noise. What do you need was always the right question, asked at exactly the right moment, by exactly the right person. I need to talk to Firenze before the DMLE gets here, Harry said. I need to understand what the herd's demand actually means legally, what powers it gives us, what the trial looks like. I need Hermione to keep researching purity curses because the more we know about the specific signatures the harder it'll be for anyone to minimize them. He paused. And I need someone to make sure Professor McGonagall knows everything before Dumbledore gets to talk to her first. Ron and Hermione exchanged a look. I'll take McGonagall, Ron said immediately. Hermione, you do the research. Harry, I'll talk to Firenze. Deal. Ron stood, then stopped. He put his hand on Harry's shoulder very briefly, a Ron Weasley expression of feeling that avoided anything that could be called emotional, and then he was gone. Hermione was already back in the book. Harry got up and went to find the centaur. Firenze had not, in fact, left the castle. Harry found him in the entrance hall, standing by the window that faced the steps, watching the unicorn herd with an expression of quiet attention. He turned when Harry came down the stairs, and there was something in the way he turned, fully, directly, without any of the half-attention that most people gave Harry even at the best of times, that Harry registered and appreciated. You slept, Firenze observed. Some. Harry came to stand beside him at the window. The morning light was stronger now, and the unicorns caught it and threw it back in sharp angles, their horns bright as new silver. I need to understand what the herd's demand actually does. Legally. What it means for the trial. It means that the trial cannot be dismissed, postponed, or quietly resolved, Firenze said. The Accords of Naturally Sovereign Magical Species are among the oldest binding magical law in Britain. They predate the Ministry by 3 centuries and the Ministry has no mechanism to repeal them without the consent of every signatory species, which would require agreement from centaurs, unicorns, thestrals, merpeople, and approximately 14 other species who have not spoken in council since 1743. His expression was very level. The Ministry cannot make this go away. They can only process it. Who presides? Under Article 7, the presiding authority must be a senior ministry official with no prior allegiance to the accused. The herd's demand specified a formal magical trial, which means a Wisengamot-level proceeding. In practice, this means the DMLE will assign a head examiner. Firenze paused. I have sent a message, through Centaur channels, to Amelia Bones. Harry turned to look at him. You know Bones? I know of her. The Centaur community observes ministry figures carefully. It is useful to know which ones can be trusted to follow law even when it inconveniences them. A slight pause. Amelia Bones is that kind. Harry filed this. The herd, can they communicate anything more specific to the trial? Like the individual signatures, can they identify each curse, when it was placed, under what circumstances? Firenze was quiet for a moment, the way he got quiet when he was listening to something Harry couldn't hear. Outside, the matriarch's head turned fractionally toward the window, and Firenze said, Solara says yes. She has held the record of your magical signature since your first night in this forest. She can identify each Vethra individually, the precise magical fingerprint of each one, when it was placed in terms of your magical development age, and the cumulative effect of their layering. Harry absorbed that. Solara. That's her name. That is the name the herd uses in a form we can pronounce. Her true name is longer. Firenze looked at him sideways. She says you may call her Solara. She would not say that to everyone. Harry looked through the window at the old unicorn, who was standing exactly as she'd stood all night, patient and certain and magnificent. Tell her I'm grateful. Firenze relayed this in some way Harry couldn't detect, a very small gesture, a shift in attention, and Solara's ears moved in that precise, deliberate way. She says gratitude is unnecessary. She says that what she is doing is correct, and correct things do not require gratitude. A faint pause. She says you know this already. Harry thought about standing on the step last night and telling the matriarch they'll answer for it. He thought about the feeling that had accompanied it, not triumph, not relief, but the very specific sensation of being aligned with something true. Yeah, he said quietly. I do. McGonagall found him at 8. He heard her coming from around the corner, her footsteps had a specific rhythm, brisk and purposeful, a sound he'd been hearing since age 11 and had learned to parse the way you parse weather, and when she came into view she was walking with a particular kind of controlled urgency that told him Ron had gotten to her, and that what Ron had told her had landed the way it was supposed to land. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him for a long moment with her sharp eyes, and in those eyes Harry saw something that McGonagall rarely let anyone see, not the teacher, not the head of house, not the deputy headmistress, but the woman underneath those roles, who was currently furious in a way that had nothing performative about it. Mr. Potter, she said, and then stopped. Started again. Harry. She never called him Harry. He'd been her student for 4 years and she'd called him Mr. Potter every single time except once, when he'd first climbed on a broom and she'd said Harry, that was extraordinary, and then immediately reassembled her professional face over the sentence and sent him to Oliver Wood. Professor, he said. How are you feeling? Fine. Don't say fine when you don't mean it. I've been dealing with students saying fine for 37 years and I know what it looks like. Harry thought about it. Steady, he said, which was closer to true. I'm feeling steady. She held his gaze. Mr. Weasley told me the essentials. I'd like you to tell me the rest. She paused. And I want you to know, before you do, whatever I'm about to hear, my job in this conversation is to listen. Not to explain or contextualize or manage. The word came out with a slight edge, as if she'd tried several other words first and rejected them. I'm listening. So Harry told her too. And this time he included something he hadn't included in the version he told Hermione and Ron, the feeling of standing in the meadow looking at the shimmer above his chest and understanding, viscerally, that the ceilings he'd always assumed were part of the landscape were actually walls that had been built. He told it without heat, without making her responsible for his feelings about it, because she wasn't responsible. But he told it fully, because she'd asked for full. When he finished, McGonagall was standing very still with her hands clasped in front of her and her face arranged in an expression that Harry recognized from Transfiguration occasionally, the expression of someone who has just been shown that something they believe to be structurally sound is not. He'd seen it on her face when a theory failed to work in practice. He'd never expected to see it in this context. 37 years, she said, very quietly, and Harry understood without asking that she was not talking to him. Professor, no. She held up one hand. Not dismissively, just firmly. She needed a moment and she was taking it with the same efficiency she applied to everything. After 5 seconds, when does the DMLE arrive? Pomfrey sent the report last night. Forenza says Amelia Bones has been contacted. I'd imagine this morning. I see. She straightened, she was already straight, but she found an additional degree of it somewhere. I will be present for their arrival. I will be present for every stage of whatever follows. She looked at him with the particular directness she reserved for important statements. And I want it understood, by you and by anyone who needs to know it, that my position in this matter is with you. Not with the school's reputation, not with the perception of the Board of Governors, and not with any individual whose name I am not yet prepared to say in a corridor. A pause. Is that clear? Very clear, Harry said. Good. She touched his shoulder, the most contact McGonagall had probably ever made in a non-emergency, and coming from her it meant considerably more than a hug from most people, and turned and walked back the way she'd come with that same purposeful stride. Harry stood in the entrance hall and breathed. The DMLE arrived at 9:30. Harry was at breakfast, or at least he was sitting at the Gryffindor table with food in front of him that he was consuming at about 30% of his normal rate, when the great hall doors opened and Amelia Bones walked in with 2 junior aurors and an expression that said she hadn't slept particularly well and was not presently interested in anyone's feelings about that. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair and rectangular glasses and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement not because she had to but because she genuinely believed in it, which was a rarer combination than most people thought. Harry had seen her once, briefly, during the Triwizard Tournament administrative meetings that he'd glimpsed from corridors, and he'd filed her as someone who asked questions and waited until she got an actual answer. She scanned the great hall with the professional efficiency of someone cataloging an unfamiliar space, and her eyes found Harry with minimal delay. He stood up. The great hall, which had been maintaining a careful pretense of normal breakfast, chose this moment to abandon that pretense entirely. The noise level dropped in the specific way it drops when everyone has simultaneously decided to pay attention to the same thing and is trying not to look like they have. Harry walked the length of the Gryffindor table to meet her. He was aware of every pair of eyes in the room following him and he decided not to be bothered by it. Director Bones, he said. Mr. Potter. Her voice was level and direct, like her questions. I've read Madame Pomfrey's report. I'd like to speak with you privately. The hospital wing, Harry said. Madame Pomfrey will be there, and Forenza is acting as the herd's representative. If that's acceptable. She looked at him for a moment with the slightly recalibrating expression of someone who'd expected to be managing a 15-year-old and had encountered something slightly different. That's acceptable. They walked out of the great hall together. Behind them, Harry heard the noise level return immediately, higher than before. In the hospital wing, with Pomfrey present and Forenza standing at the window and the 2 junior aurors taking notes near the door, Amelia Bones sat across from Harry and put a dictaquil on the table between them and looked at him and said, "Tell me everything, in order, starting from when you entered the forest last night." Harry told it again. He was getting good at telling it, not because he'd rehearsed it but because each telling clarified it further, stripped away the irrelevant and left the essential, like working clay. By the 4th time he told a story it was always its true shape. Bones listened without interrupting. She asked no questions until he'd finished, and then they were precise questions, the kind designed not to lead but to fill in gaps. What did the shimmer look like? How clearly could he distinguish the individual signatures? Had he felt anything in the forest on previous visits that might retrospectively indicate the curse's presence? Was there any moment in his time at Hogwarts when his magical response to a situation had seemed disproportionately muted? That last question made him think for a long moment. Yes, he said. Frequently. I'd put it down to, I don't know. Being under pressure. Not being properly trained. Fear. He looked at his hands. But it was consistent in a way that fear isn't. Fear spikes and recedes. This was, a constant floor. Like the bottom of my response kept hitting something. Bones wrote something, or the dictaquill did. And Madame Pomfrey's examination confirmed 29 distinct signatures. 29, Pomfrey confirmed from the side of the room. Her voice was professionally neutral and professionally angry in equal measure. Each one is a complete and distinct sovereign diminishment working. Not variations on a single curse, 29 separate intentional applications. Bones looked at Forenza. The herd's formal demand, you are prepared to provide testimony regarding its validity under the Accords? I am, Forenza said. And the herd's identification of the cursecaster's magical signature, this will hold up to examination by our curse analysis department. Solara's identification is not a matter of opinion, Forenza said, with the particular centaur dryness that Harry had come to recognize as the species' version of emphasis. A unicorn of her age has a magical memory longer and more precise than anything your department possesses. Her identification will not only hold up, it will make your department's instruments look imprecise. Bones absorbed this. She put her pen down. She looked at Harry with a directness that reminded him, slightly, of Solara, the quality of seeing without editorializing. Mr. Potter, I want to be honest with you about what this process involves. A trial convened under the Accords is binding and non-dismissible. That's to your advantage. It also means it will be public, contentious, and long. There will be people, powerful people, who argue for alternative explanations. Who attempt to minimize what was done to you. Who will use the political capital at their disposal to complicate the proceedings. She paused. I want to make sure you understand what you're starting. I understand what I'm starting, Harry said. I also understand what was started without my consent 14 years ago. He met her eyes. I'd like to finish it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then, you'll have my full support in that. She picked up her pen again. Now. The accused, Albus Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts, has been at this school since your first year, which means he has had consistent access to your person. My department will need to examine whether any staff members were aware of or complicit in the placement of the curses. She said it flatly, the way good investigators say the things nobody wants to say, not cruelly, but clearly. Are there any individuals here who you believe may have had knowledge? Harry thought about Snape. He thought about the complicated architecture of Snape's position, the things Snape knew, the things Snape did with what he knew, the space between those two things that Harry had never been able to map cleanly. He thought about the fact that Snape had been watching him for 4 years with an attention that had always felt like more than general dislike, an attention that occasionally, in unguarded moments, looked almost like vigilance. There may be, he said carefully. I don't have evidence. But there's someone whose testimony might be complicated. Bones made a note. We'll conduct individual interviews. Anyone with access to you will need to be examined. She looked up. That includes every member of staff. The door opened. Harry had not heard Dumbledore coming, because Dumbledore moved without audible footsteps when he chose to, a fact that had always seemed elegant before and now seemed like something else entirely. He stood in the doorway in his teaching robes, silver-haired and composed, and the room rearranged itself slightly around his presence the way it always did, the instinctive deference that 30 years of the wizarding world's respect produced in a space. Bones stood up immediately. She did not look deferential. Headmaster Dumbledore. I was going to request an interview at 10. I thought I might simplify matters, Dumbledore said, with the quiet warmth that Harry now watched with a new eye, seeing the mechanism behind it without losing awareness of the fact that the warmth itself was not entirely fabricated. That was the most unsettling thing about him. He genuinely cared. He genuinely believed. Those two facts did not in any way mitigate what he'd done, but they made the shape of it more complex than simple malice, which was harder to be clean about. Whatever questions you have for me, Director Bones, I'm prepared to answer them. That's very cooperative of you, Bones said, in a tone that sounded like a compliment and wasn't. Dumbledore's eyes moved to Harry. They were blue and they were old and they were doing the thing they always did, seeing more than they should, understanding more than could be comfortable, and Harry met them without flinching and without performing the absence of feeling. He felt things. Betrayal was one of them. Clarity was another. He let Dumbledore see both. Harry, Dumbledore said, and there was something in his voice that was genuine. That was the problem with him and always had been. I would very much like to explain. I know, Harry said. You'll have the opportunity to do that at the trial. Dumbledore was still. Something in his face shifted, not the composure, that stayed perfectly in place, but something behind it, something older and more tired. He had, Harry understood, expected this to go differently. He had probably prepared for several versions of this morning, and the version in which Harry was quiet and steady and completely declined to be managed had not been the one he'd most prepared for. I see, Dumbledore said. I hope so, Harry said. By midday, Hogwarts was a changed place in the way that institutions change when something structural has been revealed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in 1,000 small adjustments, each one a response to the new shape of the information available. Students gathered in clusters with the particular energy of shared alarm. Teachers moved through the corridors with careful faces and quick steps. The portraits murmured to each other in low voices, the way they did when the news was significant enough to travel all the way back to when their subjects had been alive. The unicorns were still on the steps, and by noon word had spread far enough that even the students who'd missed the morning commotion knew they were there, and why they were there, or some version of why. The version spreading through the school was simplified: there are unicorns outside because something happened to Harry, but the direction of it was accurate, and Harry noticed that the simplified version had one detail correct in every telling: it was Dumbledore. Hermione found him at lunch with a second book and notes covering 4 inches of parchment. Okay, she said, sliding into the seat beside him without preamble, listen to this. Purity curses, when applied in numbers larger than 5, begin to interact with each other. The text calls it resonant diminishment, where each additional curse doesn't just add its individual effect but amplifies the effect of all the others. At 29, the cumulative effect would be, she scanned her notes, potentially as much as an 80% suppression of natural magical development and expression. 80%, Harry. Ron, across the table, stopped chewing. Harry put down his fork. 80%. That's the upper estimate. But the lower estimate is still 60. Which means at minimum, you have been operating at 40% of your actual capability for your entire time at Hogwarts. She looked at him over the top of her notes with the expression of someone delivering numbers they wish were different. Whatever you've done, every spell, every duel, every magical encounter, you've done it with most of yourself locked away. Harry thought about the basilisk. He thought about the Triwizard Tournament. He thought about the Patronus he'd cast against 100 Dementors, which people had called extraordinary. He thought about what extraordinary meant when the person performing it had been doing it at 40%. That's a lot, Ron said, which was, in characteristic Ron fashion, both an understatement and the exact right thing to say. Yeah, Harry said. It is. He picked up his fork again. He ate the rest of his lunch steadily and without particular expression, because the anger was there. It had been there since the meadow, building with a patience that was almost restful, but he'd decided that it was going to be useful or it was going to be nothing, and useful anger needed fuel, not immediate release. Outside the window, Solara stood in the winter light with her horn raised and her gold eyes facing forward, and Harry thought, 60 years of greater good, and in the end it was a unicorn who decided enough. He was glad, with a completeness that surprised him, that it had been. At 3 in the afternoon, Harry went back to the hospital wing for Pomfrey's follow-up examination, and she ran the deep resonance scan again, and this time he watched the shimmer above his chest with the knowledge of what he was looking at and let himself count again, slowly, properly, each individual signature distinct and separate and old. 1. Placed when he was very young, the signature was faint with age, almost incorporated, the oldest scar. This was the first. He held it in his awareness and moved on. 2, 3, 4, placed close together in time, a cluster, the magical equivalent of a deliberate pattern, each one reinforcing the others. He counted through to 29, taking his time. When he finished, Pomfrey said, "Well." "Still 29, Harry said. "Yes." She looked at the shimmer and then at him. "When the trial is complete, when the legal process has run its course, they'll need to be removed. The removal of purity curses at this level it's not a straightforward process, Harry. I want you prepared for that." "How complicated?" "The oldest ones are partly integrated. The body accommodates what's been there long enough and builds around it." She said it with clinical honesty. "Removing them will feel like, it will be painful. And there may be effects afterward that we can't fully predict. Your magical expression will shift significantly. You'll need time to adjust to yourself." Harry looked at the shimmer. "Can it be done safely? With the right specialist?" "Yes." She met his eyes. "We'll find the right specialist." "Okay," Harry said. "Then we'll do it." He lay back on the examination bed and stared at the vaulted ceiling and thought about the word afterward, and about what 40% had looked like, and about what the rest of it might feel like when it finally had somewhere to go. Outside, on the steps of Hogwarts Castle, Solara stood in the fading afternoon light and waited for justice with the patience of something that had been waiting for this particular moment for a very long time. It wasn't waiting much longer. Chapter 3, The Language of Old Things. The summons came at midnight. Not a letter, not a knock on the dormitory door, not any of the usual mechanisms the castle used to move people from one place to another. It was a feeling, specific, directional, the same tingling in Harry's palms that had been his constant companion since the meadow, except that now it had a quality of urgency to it, a vector. He woke from a light sleep with the sensation of being called the way a compass needle is called, not aggressively but with the complete certainty of something that has one purpose and is presently fulfilling it. He was out of bed and pulling on his robe before he was fully awake. Ron stirred in the next bed. "Harry. Go back to sleep." "That's not an answer." "Forest," Harry said quietly. "The herd wants something." A pause. Ron sat up, rubbing his face. "I'll come." "You don't have to." "I know." Ron was already reaching for his jumper. "That's why I'm coming." Harry didn't argue. The truth was that Ron's presence, large, warm, practically competent, was the kind of thing Harry had stopped knowing how to turn down, and he suspected Ron knew that too, which was why he offered it simply and without fanfare. They left the dormitory without waking the others and moved through the castle under Harry's invisibility cloak, two shapes under one piece of fabric, navigating the familiar dark by memory and the faint light from the windows. The unicorns were not on the steps when they opened the front doors. Harry's palms told him where they'd gone before his eyes adjusted to the dark. The tingling was pointing into the forest, southeast, toward the meadow. "They moved," Ron observed. "They want me at the meadow." Ron pulled his wand. "Right. Then we go to the meadow." The forest at midnight was a different creature than the forest at dusk. It had settled into its full, enormous self, the sounds deeper, the dark more absolute, the sense of being inside something that was alive and aware of you considerably more present. Harry moved without a lantern because the tingling in his palms was sufficient navigation and because carrying a light in the forbidden forest at midnight was an advertisement he didn't need to make. Ron walked beside him and said nothing, which was one of Ron's most underrated qualities. He could be loud and opinionated and occasionally oblivious, but he had a gift for reading the moments when noise was wrong and silence was correct, and he exercised it now without being asked. They reached the meadow in 11 minutes. Harry stopped at the tree line. The herd was there. All 11, arranged in the same configuration as the night before, Solara at the front, the others behind in a loose semicircle, but something was different about the arrangement tonight. The energy of it was different. The previous night had been about declaration, about the herd assembling to make a demand. This was something else. This felt like an invitation. Solara stepped forward when Harry emerged from the trees. She moved with that same impossible precision, each step a kind of statement, and stopped in front of him at the same distance as before, 6 feet, close enough to see the gold of her eyes clearly in the dark. They were bright. Not with moonlight, because the moon was behind cloud, but with something internal, an illumination that came from whatever Solara was at her most fundamental level. She lowered her horn toward him. "I think she wants to show me something," Harry said quietly. "Yeah," Ron said, from 2 feet to his left. "Yeah, that tracks. Do you want me to, stay where you are?" "I'll be fine." He walked forward until he was close enough to feel the warmth radiating from Solara's coat, which was real and physical and distinctly different from the warmth of other animals, a cleaner warmth, the warmth of something that didn't accumulate the ambient cold the way mortal things did. Up close, she was enormous and she was quiet and she was the most obviously ancient thing Harry had ever stood beside, including Dumbledore, including the castle itself. He reached up and placed his palm against the side of her neck. What happened this time was not the counting in the meadow, not the inventory. What happened was immersion. He was standing in the meadow and simultaneously not in the meadow, he was somewhere else that was layered on top of where he was standing, a double exposure of location and time. He was in the hospital wing. He was 11 years old, newly arrived at Hogwarts, sitting on the examination bed while Madame Pomfrey ran first-year health checks. The image was not from his memory. His memories of that evening were the usual vague impressions of being tired and overwhelmed and new, but from Solara's, which were precise in a completely different way. Solara's memory didn't record emotions the way human memory did. It recorded signatures. And what Solara had recorded on that night was the moment when a second presence had moved through the room while Dumbledore conducted what Harry had believed was a routine check-in visit. The second presence was magical. Solara showed him its quality, a deep, deliberate magic, old in the way that old academics become old, dense with accumulated knowledge, carrying the specific signature that Harry now knew from 29 iterations in his own chest. The presence moved into the room, and into the air around 11-year-old Harry, and placed the first Vethra with a care that was almost surgical. Precise. Practiced. This was not the first time these hands had performed this working. The image shifted. He was older now, 12, maybe 13, and the setting was Dumbledore's office, a meeting that Harry genuinely remembered, a routine end-of-term check-in where Dumbledore had offered him lemon drops and asked how he was finding his classes. In Solara's version of this memory, witnessed through the forest's awareness of Harry's magical signature, a tracking that had been continuous since his first night in these trees, he watched the second, third, and fourth Vethra laid over the first like transparent films, each one keyed precisely to the magical development stage Harry had reached, each one recalibrated to ensure the ceiling moved with him. As he grew, the curses were updated. They weren't static. They were maintained. He watched maintenance visits 3, 6, 7. He watched them laid in classrooms and in the Quidditch changing room and once, with a coldness that took his breath, in the hospital wing while he was unconscious and recovering from the end-of-year encounter with Quirrell and the stone. He'd been unconscious. He'd been 11 years old and unconscious in the hospital wing with Dumbledore sitting beside his bed, and Dumbledore had updated the curses while he slept. The meadow came back. Harry realized his hand had tightened against Solara's neck, not hurting her, she was beyond being hurt by anything so small, but he was gripping rather than resting, and he made himself ease it. He breathed. He was 15 years old and standing in a meadow at midnight with a unicorn showing him the map of his own containment, and the map was detailed and it was clear and every landmark on it had been placed there by someone who had looked at him and decided, with complete conviction, that smaller was safer. "Okay," he said, quietly, to Solara. "Keep going." She did. He was in the meadow for 40 minutes. Ron, behind him, did not interrupt, did not ask questions, and when Harry finally lowered his hand from Solara's neck and stood quietly for a moment doing the breathing that people do when they're organizing something large into manageable sections, Ron simply walked up beside him and stood there. Not asking. Not offering. Just present. After a while, Harry said, "She showed me all 29. All of them. When they were placed, where, how they interact with each other. The whole architecture." He looked at his hands. The tingling had changed, it was sharper now, more specific, the way pain gets sharper when you've properly identified its location. It wasn't just suppression. They were calibrated. Every time I had a significant growth period, every time my magical capacity expanded, the curses were adjusted to compensate. Maintenance visits. At least once a year. More in the years when I grew faster. Ron was quiet for a moment. In the years when he stopped. Started again. Like, after the basilisk? Yes. After the Dementors, 3rd year? Yes. After the tournament? Harry didn't answer immediately. The image Solara had shown him from the previous year, the most recent maintenance visit, performed in a brief contact during a private meeting that Harry had thought was about Voldemort's return, about plans for Harry's safety, about the Order, landed in him with a specific weight. Yes, he said. Most recently. Last June. Ron made a sound that was not quite a word but was entirely comprehensible. The thing is, Harry said, because he'd been thinking about this for the 40 minutes and the thought had resolved into something clean, he was doing it because he genuinely believed I'd be safer. Smaller. Less of a target. Less likely to act too soon and get myself killed. He looked up at the stars, visible now between breaks in the cloud. I'm not saying that like it excuses it. It doesn't. I'm saying it because understanding why he did it is what lets me know exactly what needs to happen next. Which is. He answers for it. In public. In a format where the reasons get examined and the consequences get determined by law, not by his judgment. Harry turned to face Ron. Because the problem isn't that he thought he knew best. Lots of people think they know best. The problem is that he made the decision to act on that belief inside me without asking. And that's not protection. That's management. He let the word sit. I'm done being managed. Ron held his gaze for a moment. Yeah, he said. You are. They stood in the meadow for another minute. Solara had stepped back and rejoined the herd, who stood with their characteristic patient attention, and Harry looked at her, at the whole of them, and felt something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite alliance but was in the vicinity of both. They'd chosen to act on this. They could have observed and stayed quiet, could have filed it in the long record of human magical violations that magical creatures witnessed and did not intervene in. Instead they'd called him to the meadow and shown him himself and put their ancient, binding legal authority behind a demand for justice. They'd done it because it was correct. That was what Solara had said through Forenza, and standing in the meadow now Harry understood that this was not a small thing to be. Something that acted because acting was correct, without calculation, without agenda. He found himself wanting to be that kind of thing. We need to write everything down, he said. Every placement she showed me, the date, the location, the circumstances. Before the trial, I need it documented. Hermione, Ron said immediately. Yes. She's going to want to come to the meadow herself. She can't. Solara won't show it to anyone else. Harry thought about it. But she can work with what I tell her. She'll turn it into something the trial can use. Ron pulled his robe tighter against the cold. Harry. When the curses come off, I know. Do you though? Because Hermione's numbers, 60 to 80%, that's, Ron searched for words in the practical register that was his native language. That's like someone who's been told they can only use one hand for their entire life suddenly getting both hands back. That's not a small adjustment. I know, Harry said again. Are you scared? He thought about it honestly, the way he'd thought about McGonagall's question honestly that morning. "No," he said, after a moment. "I think I should be. But I'm not." He paused. "I think I'm curious." Ron looked at him for a moment, and then he laughed, short, genuine, surprised out of him. "Yeah," he said. "That sounds about right." They were back in the castle by 1 in the morning, and Harry was awake for another 2 hours at the desk in the dormitory with a quill and several sheets of parchment, writing down everything Solara had shown him while the sequence was still precise in his mind. He wrote it chronologically: age 11, hospital wing, first visit. Age 11, office, 2nd through 4th. Age 12, onwards. He wrote the magical quality of each placement as Solara had shown it, the texture, the depth, the way it had interfaced with his existing signature. He wrote the circumstances, the cover stories, the ordinary interactions that had been cover for something else entirely. When he finished he had 9 pages. He stared at them for a while. 9 pages of his own life, written in his own handwriting, describing things that had been done to him without his knowledge, by someone who had told him for 4 years that everything happening to Harry Potter was for Harry Potter's own good. He folded them carefully and put them in the inside pocket of his robes, closest to his chest. Then he went to bed and slept without dreaming until morning. Amelia Bones had requested a staff meeting at 9, and Harry had requested, not asked, but requested, to be present. Bones had agreed without hesitation. Dumbledore had not objected, which told Harry something about the current state of Dumbledore's political position. He was running a conservation strategy, preserving capital for the trial rather than spending it on procedural objections. McGonagall had taken Harry's request and turned it into a fact without any additional discussion, which was how McGonagall operated when she'd made up her mind about something. By 8:30 she was at his side in the corridor outside the staff room with her wand in her sleeve and an expression that communicated, to anyone who was paying attention, that she had chosen a side and had done so with full consideration and complete finality. The staff room was full. Harry had never seen all the teachers in one room outside of meals, and the collective presence of Hogwarts faculty was a specific kind of atmosphere, weighty, particular, the combined magical signatures of 20-odd people who'd spent their careers in one of the most magically dense buildings in Britain. They arranged themselves around the room with the unconscious hierarchy of people who'd worked together for years, Flitwick near the window, Sprout by the door, Trelawney slightly apart from everyone else in a way she probably read as mystical and that everyone else read as Trelawney. Snape stood near the back. Harry looked at Snape the way Solara had taught him to look at things, for the signature, the quality, the information underneath the surface. Snape was watching him with black eyes that were doing something complicated and heavily controlled, and Harry filed it the way he'd been filing things since the meadow, adding it to the ledger. Bones stood at the front of the room. Dumbledore sat to one side, not at the head of the room, which was where he would normally sit in any gathering, but to the side, which was either a deliberate gesture of deference to the process or a deliberate performance of deference that came to the same practical result either way. "Thank you all for being here," Bones said, in a tone that made it clear that thanks were not actually part of what she was offering. "I'll be direct. My department has received and reviewed Madame Pomfrey's report regarding Mr. Potter. The findings are legally serious and have triggered mandatory proceedings under the Accords of Naturally Sovereign Magical Species. I want everyone in this room to understand what that means for the next several weeks." She laid it out with the efficient precision of someone who did this professionally. The trial would be convened at Hogwarts, because the magical violations had occurred here and the primary witnesses, including the unicorn herd, were most easily accessed here. The Wizengamot would send a panel of 7 senior members to observe and adjudicate. Bones herself would serve as head examiner. All relevant parties would be required to testify, and testimony would be taken under veritaserum with the option to refuse individual questions. Refusal would be noted and treated as potentially indicative. That includes all staff members who had regular access to Mr. Potter, Bones said, and her eyes moved, briefly but deliberately, around the room. We are not assuming guilt on the part of anyone beyond the primary accused. We are, however, conducting thorough inquiry. Anyone who has information relevant to these proceedings should come forward to me directly before the formal trial begins. Cooperation will be factored into how this office treats any secondary involvement. The room was very quiet. Harry watched Snape. Something moved through Snape's face in the silence, not guilt exactly, but a cousin of it, the expression of someone calculating the cost of several different options at high speed and not finding any of them comfortable. "Mr. Potter," Bones said, "do you wish to say anything to this assembly?" He hadn't expected to be asked. He stood up from the chair he'd been given near the door. McGonagall had placed the chair there, which meant McGonagall had planned for this, which was why McGonagall was McGonagall, and looked around the room. "Yes," he said. "One thing." He let his eyes move around the faces, not in challenge but in simple direct attention. "Whatever any of you knew or didn't know, whatever your reasons were for anything, the trial is where that gets resolved. I'm not going to make it personal in this room. But I want everyone to understand that I'm not going to make it easy, either." He paused. "I've been at this school for 4 years and I've been managed. I've had my judgment doubted, my instincts overruled, my power suppressed. I was 15 before a unicorn told me what had been done to me in the place I was supposed to be safest." He kept his voice level and clear. "So when Director Bones says come forward with information, I'd take that seriously. Because I know more than I used to, and the distance between what I know and what I can prove is currently shrinking." He sat down. The staff room was very, very quiet. And then Snape, of all people, who Harry would have ranked last in any room for likely spontaneous cooperation, said, in a voice that was precise and even in cost him something visible, "Director Bones. I would like to request a private interview at your earliest convenience." Every head in the room turned toward the back wall. Snape met no one's eyes. His expression was the controlled blankness he used when feeling something he had no intention of performing, which Harry now recognized as different from his usual contempt the way genuine silence is different from the absence of noise. "I have information relevant to the proceedings," he said. "I have had it for some time." Bones looked at him for a moment. "This afternoon," she said. 2 o'clock. Snape nodded once and said nothing further, and Harry looked at him across the staff room and thought about the space between what a person knows and what they do with it, and the fact that doing the right thing late was not the same as doing the right thing on time, but it was also not nothing. Hermione got the 9 pages at breakfast. She read them at the table with a focus so complete that she twice failed to respond when Ron spoke to her, which Ron accepted with the equanimity of someone who had known Hermione for 4 years and had calibrated his expectations accordingly. When she finished she put the pages down and sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the middle distance in the way that meant she was sorting something very large and needed 60 seconds to complete the sort. Then, "Harry, do you understand what's in these pages?" "I wrote them," Harry said. "I know. But do you understand what they mean? Because each individual placement, the timing, the calibration, the fact that they were updated to compensate for your magical growth, this isn't a series of decisions. This is a system. Someone designed this. They thought about it carefully, they built it methodically, and they maintained it over years." She tapped the pages. "This is going to be the most important document in the trial. Because it proves intent. Not a single moment of bad judgment, an intentional, maintained program of magical suppression." Harry looked at the pages. "Can you organize it in a form the trial can use?" "Already thinking about it." She picked up her quill. "I want to cross-reference the placement dates with your known magical development milestones, growth periods, major encounters, Quidditch performances, exam results. Build a timeline that shows exactly how the curses tracked your development. Make it impossible to argue coincidence or poor judgment." "That's perfect," Harry said. "That's Hermione," Ron said, in the tone of someone stating a fact. She looked up from the pages with an expression that was halfway between gratified and irritated, which was her most common reaction to Ron's compliments, and went back to work. At noon, Harry went to find Forenza. The Centaur was in the east corridor on the ground floor, Dumbledore had offered him a guest room, which Firenze had declined, and the corridor had become a sort of informal base, which Firenze occupied with the calm of someone who was comfortable in in-between spaces. Harry sat on the floor with his back against the wall and Firenze stood beside him, and the comfortable thing about Firenze was that this arrangement required no explanation from either of them. "She showed me everything," Harry said. "I thought she would." Firenze looked down at him. "How are you feeling about it?" "Clear," Harry said, which was the truest word for it. "Like I've been looking at a map that was missing features and someone just printed the full version." Firenze was quiet for a moment. "The trial begins in 3 days. The Wisengamot panel arrived this morning, I saw them crossing the grounds. 7 members, which is the minimum for an Accords proceeding." He paused. "The castle knows something is happening. You can feel it in the stone." Harry could, actually. Hogwarts, which was alive in ways that nobody had ever fully mapped, sentient in some distributed and impersonal way, responsive to the emotional weather of its inhabitants, felt different than usual. Not tense, exactly. More like attentive. Like a large, very old thing that had been half asleep and had woken up because something correct was about to happen. "Firenze," Harry said, "what happens to the herd after the trial?" "After, whatever the verdict is?" The Centaur considered this. "If justice is done, genuinely done, not performed, they will return to the forest. Their demand will be satisfied." He looked toward the castle's front doors, in the direction of the steps where the herd waited. "Solara has not left these grounds in 40 years. Not since," he stopped. Harry looked up. "Since what?" Firenze's expression was careful. "Since a young wizard died in this forest." Not the one you're thinking of. "Before that. A student, many years ago, who came to the forest alone with a damaged magical core, and whom the herd tried to help, and whose death Solara has carried since." He paused. "She stayed. She told the herd she would remain until the forest's connection to the castle's students was properly honored. In 40 years, no one in the castle bothered to ask why she was always there. No one but you, tonight, asked her name." Harry thought about that for a while. The forest outside, enormous and dark and full of things that moved in ways human beings didn't fully understand, held in its center a herd of creatures who had been paying attention for 40 years to a connection no one in the castle had thought to maintain. Who had been watching Harry Potter specifically for 4 of those years, tracking the curses placed in him, waiting for the moment when he was old enough to be told. Who had assembled 11 strong on a cold Thursday night to demand that something done in the dark be brought into the light. He thought about natural law, older than ministry law, older than Hogwarts, older than Dumbledore's particular vision of the greater good. The kind of law that didn't require enforcement because it was simply the shape of things, and when violated simply waited, the way water waits behind a dam, for the structure to fail. "Tell her thank you," he said to Firenze. "Not for the trial. For the 40 years." Firenze nodded. "She will hear it." The afternoon brought Snape's interview with Bones, and Harry wasn't present for it, but he heard about it. Not from Bones, who was professional about process, but from Hermione, who had been in the library adjacent to the office Bones had commandeered and who had heard, through the stone walls of Hogwarts which were thick but not perfectly soundproof, the tone of Snape's voice if not the specific words. The tone, Hermione reported, was the voice Snape used in potions when a student had made a serious error, precise, controlled, and cutting, but cutting in the direction of his own position. He sounded like he was prosecuting himself, she said, which told Harry most of what he needed to know. Snape found Harry in the corridor at 5. Harry stopped walking. Snape stopped walking. They regarded each other across 6 feet of stone corridor in the particular silence of 2 people who have a long and complicated history and are both currently in the process of reassessing it. "I spoke to Director Bones," Snape said, which was technically information Harry already had. "I heard." Snape's jaw was tight. The controlled blankness was in place, but underneath it, Harry looked for the signature, the way Solara had taught him, there was something genuine, something that had cost Snape something to bring to the surface and was not going to be dressed up as anything other than what it was. I was aware, Snape said, of the presence of suppression workings in your magical signature. I detected them approximately 3 years ago during a routine observation exercise in defense class. He paused. I did not know their full scope. I did not know their precise nature. I did not know who had placed them. But you suspected, Harry said. A long pause. Yes. And you didn't, no. The word landed flat and didn't make excuses for itself. I did not. Harry looked at him. He thought about what that had cost Snape to say, Snape, who collected debts and advantages like currency, who gave nothing away without calculation. He thought about what it meant that Snape was saying it at all, now, here, before anyone could compel him to. Why are you telling me? Harry asked. Because I will be testifying under Veritaserum in 3 days, Snape said, and it is preferable, in my judgment, for you to hear it from me first. He held Harry's gaze. I also, he stopped. The blankness shifted. I am telling you because it is what should have been done 3 years ago, and I am aware that it was not. They stood in the corridor for another moment, and Harry made a decision, not to forgive, because that wasn't what was being asked and wouldn't have been honest to offer, but to accept the information and file it in the right place. Snape had known something and hadn't acted on it and was now, in the most controlled and least demonstrative way available to him, acknowledging that this was wrong. I'll see you at the trial, Harry said. Snape nodded once. He walked away. Harry watched him go, and then turned and went the other way, toward the library where Hermione was building the case that would put everything in the light. The trial was in 3 days. At dinner that evening, Harry ate with Ron and Hermione at the Gryffindor table and the 3 of them talked about nothing important for 20 minutes, Quidditch, Ron's ongoing theory about the best possible breakfast configuration, Hermione's opinions about a charms essay she'd gotten back with slightly lower marks than expected. And the conversation was normal and warm and grounding in the specific way that normal things are grounding when everything around them is not. After dinner Harry went to the window at the end of the Gryffindor common room and looked out at the steps below, where the herd stood in the evening dark, and Solara's coat caught the light from the castle windows and threw it back in that impossible way, steady and bright. 3 days. Dumbledore had run this school, this country, and in significant ways Harry's life for a very long time with the absolute confidence of someone who knew, in his bones, that he was right. He'd built systems and structures and layered curses into a 15-year-old boy with the careful hands of someone constructing something important. He'd done all of it because he genuinely believed the greater good was a real thing and that he was better positioned than most to judge what served it. Harry was about to give him the opportunity to defend that belief in public, under oath, in front of the Wizengamot and the unicorn herd and every person in this castle whose life had been shaped by the particular architecture of his certainty. He was not afraid. He was ready. Outside, Solara stood in the dark and waited, and the forest behind her was old and full of things that remembered, and the night was clear and cold and sharp with coming change. Chapter 4, What the Greater Good Costs. The Great Hall had been transformed. Not dramatically. It wasn't the tournament transformation, all spectacle and theater, but with a deliberate austerity that made it feel more serious than spectacle would have. The house tables had been removed entirely and replaced with a configuration of benches and chairs arranged in a horseshoe, the open end facing a single chair in the center that had no ornamentation whatsoever. Just a chair. Wood, plain, practical, the kind of chair that said, "This is where you sit when you are being examined." The Wizengamot panel occupied the curved bench at the horseshoe's top, 7 witches and wizards in plum robes, their expressions the collective neutrality of people professionally committed to appearing uncommitted. They had arrived on the second day, settled into the castle with minimal interaction, and spent yesterday in private consultation with Bones, which Harry had not been privy to and had not attempted to access. He'd spent that day with Hermione, reviewing the timeline she'd built from his 9 pages, which was now 23 pages with cross-references and annotations and a separate appendix that Hermione had titled Cumulative Effect Analysis and which made for reading that started cold and got colder. The students had been told that the trial was a ministry proceeding and that attendance was mandatory for 6th year and above. Harry had not argued with this. He'd thought about arguing with it, about the privacy of what was being examined, about the performance quality a student audience might give the proceedings, and then he'd thought about Dumbledore's 37 years of certainty and the way that certainty had been able to persist, partly because so much of what it did quietly. Not today. The hall filled at 8 in the morning. 6th and 7th years took the benches on the right. 5th years, grudgingly admitted when the number of interested parties exceeded the available space, filled in on the left. Staff occupied a dedicated section near the front, McGonagall already seated with the posture of someone who had arrived early and intended to see every second, Flitwick beside her, Sprout, Trelawney, Vector, the others. Snape at the end of the row, alone, his face doing the controlled blankness with the effort of someone who is actually feeling a great deal. Firenze stood at the side of the hall near the tall windows, because he didn't fit on the benches. Through those windows, visible on the grounds, the unicorn herd stood in the morning light, close enough to the glass that Solara's horn was sometimes visible when the angle was right. The Wizengamot panel had, according to Firenze, received a formal acknowledgement of the herd's presence that morning, which meant the proceedings were officially conducted under the Accord's witness provision. The herd was not in the room, but they were part of the room. Their attention was not separable from what was happening inside it. Harry sat in a chair to the left of the central examination seat, near Bones. Not the accused chair, he'd been placed as primary witness, which meant he was in the room for all testimony, not just his own. Hermione and Ron were in the student section, 3rd row, directly in his eye line. Hermione had the 23 pages on her lap. Ron had his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way that meant he was prepared to be angry for however long this took. Dumbledore entered last. It was not a theatrical entrance. Harry doubted Dumbledore had planned it as one, but it had a theatrical quality anyway because the room responded to him the way it always had, with a reflexive shift of attention that was built from 30 years of his being the most important person in any space he entered. He wore teaching robes rather than the formal Wizengamot robes he technically qualified for, which was either a statement of humility or a statement that he didn't consider himself the ministry's subject, and Harry couldn't fully determine which. He walked to the central chair and sat down, and he looked around the room with the blue eyes that had always seen everything, and when his gaze reached Harry it paused. Harry looked back at him steadily. Dumbledore looked away first. Bones opened the proceedings with the formal recitation required by the Accords, the charge, the date, the parties, the witness provision. She had a voice built for this, clear and without performance, and the recitation had the quality of a structure being laid correctly, each stone placed precisely so the one after it had somewhere solid to rest. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, she said, you are charged under the Accords of Naturally Sovereign Magical Species, Article 7, Subsection 3, and the Magical Being Rights Accords of 1623, with the intentional, unauthorized, and sustained application of 29 sovereign diminishment workings to the person of Harry James Potter, beginning in his 11th year and maintained through his 15th. The charge carries within it the elements of intent, sustained action, and breach of personal magical sovereignty. She paused. How do you respond to this charge? Dumbledore's response was, characteristically, not simple. I respond, he said, in the measured tone of someone who had thought about this answer with considerable care, with an acknowledgement that the actions described did occur, and a request that context be given full consideration before any determination is reached. Acknowledgement. Not denial. Not defiance. Harry had expected this, had expected Dumbledore to be too intelligent for denial, and had prepared for exactly this, the acknowledgement with context attached, the plea for the greater good to be weighed in the balance. Bones looked at him over her glasses. Context will be heard in full. That is the purpose of this proceeding. She turned to the Wizengamot panel. The Veritaserum will now be administered. Dumbledore accepted the 3 drops without hesitation or comment, which was itself a kind of performance. See how I cooperate, see how I have nothing to hide, and Harry watched him accept it and thought, you've been performing transparency your entire life, and the performance has been so good that almost everyone forgot it was one. The first hour was procedural, establishing the timeline, the method, the magical nature of the workings. Bones asked clean, sequential questions, and Dumbledore answered them under Veritaserum with the particular quality that Veritaserum testimony had, which was not the quality of confession but of a very honest witness to one's own actions. The drug didn't produce guilt. It produced accuracy. Yes, he had placed the first working when Harry was 11. Yes, he had maintained them with annual calibration visits. Yes, he had been aware that the working suppressed Harry's magical development. Yes, he had been aware that Harry had not consented. Yes, he had been aware of the magical being rights accords. Each answer landed in the room and stayed there, accumulating. The student section was very quiet. Harry had expected whispers and reactions and the inevitable social noise of 200 young people in an emotionally charged environment, and instead there was a silence that was not the silence of shock but the silence of comprehension, the sound a room makes when it is actually understanding something. "Mr. Dumbledore," Bones said, and she dropped the honorific deliberately, "he was not the headmaster here, he was a witness, and this was not his school at the moment, it was a legal proceeding. Can you explain, in your own words, your reasoning for placing and maintaining these workings?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Not struggling against Veritaserum, the drug didn't work that way, it didn't produce struggle, it produced honesty, but choosing the precise words with which to express something he had clearly thought about for years. "Voldemort," he said, and the name landed the way it always landed, with the particular weight of something most people still refuse to say. Tom Riddle. His return was not, in my judgment, a matter of if but of when. Harry has always been, the focal point of that conflict. The prophecy, the connection between them, the nature of the night Voldemort killed James and Lily. He paused. I have watched gifted young people go to war before. I watched them go to the First War. I watched what raw, uncontrolled power did to them, to their judgment, to their survival, to their capacity to make the decisions that survival requires rather than the decisions that power makes tempting. He looked at his hands. A boy with the full extent of his power available to him at 11, at 12, at 13, was a boy who would act. Who would push. Who would go looking for the confrontation before he was ready for it, because powerful people do. It is in the nature of power to reach toward its purpose. The room was still. I chose, Dumbledore continued, to give him time. To give him the years of relative safety that, in my judgment, would result in a more considered, more prepared wizard when the confrontation I knew was coming finally arrived. I chose containment over expression because I believed, I still believe, despite this proceeding, that the decision was correct. He looked up. His eyes found Harry across the room with a directness that was, under Veritaserum, utterly unshielded. I believe I kept you alive, Harry. I believe the boy who walked into this school at 11 with the full weight of what he was would not have survived to 15. I made a decision to preserve your life at the cost of your agency, and I did it knowingly, and I would make it again. The silence that followed was the deepest the great hall had produced in Harry's memory. Harry sat with it. He let it land and settle and he didn't react, not because he wasn't feeling things, he was, a complex and layered collection of things, but because reacting here, now, to that speech with anything other than steadiness would concede something he had no intention of conceding. He let Bones ask 2 more questions. In your judgment, she said, was there any alternative method of achieving the protective outcome you desired that did not involve suppressing Mr. Potter's magical sovereignty? A pause. Possibly. Did you pursue those alternatives? Not with the same commitment that I pursued this one. Why not? Dumbledore looked at his hands again. Under Veritaserum, he could not dress the answer up. Because this one I could control. The room broke slightly at that. Not into noise, into a kind of collective exhale, the sound of a hall full of people absorbing the honest version of something they'd accepted the polished version of for years. McGonagall, in the staff section, had gone very still in the way that very controlled people go still when something has hit them somewhere they didn't adequately protect. Bones called a 20-minute recess. Harry stood, walked to the side of the hall, and stood at the window next to Firenze. Outside, Solara was exactly where she'd been. Her gold eyes were facing the window with the specific quality of attention that Harry had come to recognize as her equivalent of listening. She couldn't hear the testimony. But she was present for it in some way that was real. "Are you all right?" Firenze asked. Yes. He was, actually. The speech had landed, "I would make it again" had landed particularly hard, but it had landed in the part of him that was clear rather than the part of him that was hurt, and the clear part was processing it as information rather than wound. He meant every word. Yes. I was prepared for that to be harder to deal with than it is. Harry looked at Solara. "I think it's actually easier to deal with than if he'd done it without believing in it. If it had been malice I could be simply angry. This way I have to," he paused, "think. The most difficult kind of wrong," Firenze said. "The kind performed with sincerity. Because the sincerity is real. The care is real. It doesn't change what it is, but it means the person who did it isn't a monster." Harry turned from the window. "Which means the verdict has to address the action, not the motive. That is what law is for," Firenze said. "When personal judgment is insufficient." Harry went back to his chair. Snape testified second. He took the examination seat with the careful precision he applied to everything, accepted the Veritaserum with the look of someone who had decided to do a necessary and unpleasant thing and was doing it without drama, and answered Bones's opening questions with a terseness that was not evasion but economy. He had known about the suppression workings. He had detected them in Harry's third year. He had identified the magical signature as consistent with Dumbledore's but had not been certain of attribution because, and here the Veritaserum produced something that Snape very clearly would have phrased differently without it, he had not wanted to be certain. "Can you explain that?" Bones asked. Snape's jaw tightened. "I had, at that time, a relationship with Dumbledore that functioned on the basis of trust extended to me in exchange for service provided. I owed him significantly. Discovering that he had placed suppression workings on Potter would have required me to either act on that discovery or to consciously choose not to act on it. Uncertainty," he said, with the precision of Veritaserum stripping the diplomatic coating from a hard truth, "was more comfortable than either option." "And when you became certain?" "I became certain in Potter's fourth year. During the tournament. The workings had been updated the previous summer and the calibration it was visible to me in a way it hadn't been previously. The magical signature was unmistakable." He looked at a point slightly above the examination chair, in the direction of no one in particular. "I chose not to act." "Why?" "Several reasons." Snape said it flatly. "Some of which I am not proud of. Potter and I have he paused, clearly searching for the Veritaserum accurate word, difficult relationship. I told myself that the curses were not actively harmful, that they were suppressive rather than injurious, that addressing them would complicate my position within the order. I told myself that Dumbledore would have reasons." He paused. "I also told myself that a less powerful Potter was a Potter who was less likely to make the kind of reckless autonomous decision that would get him killed before the war reached its necessary conclusion." He stopped. "I was aware, in saying this to myself, that I was using Dumbledore's logic. I did not examine that awareness with the rigor it deserved. The hall was quiet in the particular way it gets quiet when something truthful and uncomfortable has been said without decoration." Harry looked at Snape. Snape did not look at Harry, he was looking at that same neutral middle distance, but the tension in his shoulders had changed quality, gone from the tension of someone holding something back to the tension of someone who has put something down and is now aware of how long they were carrying it. "Is there anything else relevant to these proceedings that you wish to add?" Bones asked. A pause. "Yes." Snape's voice was precisely level. "Potter is, whatever I have communicated to him over 4 years through my conduct, Harry Potter is not a liability or a weapon or a managed asset. He stopped again, and the Veritaserum was clearly making him say something he'd spent years deliberately not saying, a person who has been in this school for 4 years and has managed consistently to do the correct thing when the adults around him were managing complications instead. He stopped. I should have acted when I knew. He looked at Harry then, directly, for exactly 2 seconds. It was not an apology in any form Harry could call comfortable. It was something more austere than an apology. It was Snape's version of a reckoning, performed in public, under Veritaserum, in front of 200 people, because he'd decided that accurate was more important than dignified. Harry held the eye contact for those 2 seconds and nodded, once. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Recognition. Snape looked away. McGonagall testified third and the room felt different for it. She sat in the examination chair with the rigidity of someone who has been upright their entire life and is currently paying the cost of it, and she accepted the Veritaserum, and she answered Bones's questions in a voice that was controlled in the way a fire in a grate is controlled, contained, directed, but genuinely burning. She had not known about the workings. The Veritaserum confirmed this clearly and without ambiguity. She had had no knowledge, no suspicion, no moment of detected irregularity in Harry's magical development that she'd chosen to ignore. She had trusted the person she worked beside for 37 years with the trust of someone who had seen that person do genuinely great things for a very long time, and that trust had not been informed by any evidence of this specific action. When Bones asked her what she thought of the action now, McGonagall was quiet for a full 5 seconds, which under Veritaserum meant she was choosing precision rather than suppression. I think, she said, that it was a fundamental betrayal of the responsibility we hold toward the students in our care. I think it was performed with genuine conviction, which does not mitigate it. I think that 37 years of trust, while they do not make me responsible for what I did not know, do make me responsible for what I do with the knowledge now. She paused. And I think that any system, any institution, any individual, that claims to protect someone while simultaneously removing their capacity to protect themselves has confused protection with possession. The room was silent. Bones said, "Thank you, Professor McGonagall." McGonagall stood, walked back to the staff section, and sat down, and she did not look at Dumbledore once during any of it. Dumbledore was recalled for supplementary questions after McGonagall's testimony, and this was where things fractured. Not explosively. Not the way things fracture in confrontations that resolve through escalation. They fractured the way old stone fractures, slowly, from internal pressure, along lines that had always been there. Bones said, "Mr. Dumbledore, you testified earlier that you believed your actions preserved Mr. Potter's life. I want to ask you to address the alternative possibility. Is it possible that the actions you took, the suppression of his magical development, the removal of his full capacity, is it possible that these actions endangered him rather than protecting him?" Dumbledore was quiet. Under Veritaserum, the quiet was honest rather than strategic. "Yes," he said finally. "It is possible. In the Triwizard Tournament. When Mr. Potter competed against opponents with full access to their magical development, yes. In his first year. Against Quirrell and the entity possessing him, yes. Every year, in every encounter, he was operating at less than half his actual capacity, yes. Your protection," Bones said, with precise legal clarity, "may in fact have been the mechanism of his danger rather than his safety." Dumbledore looked, for the first time in Harry's memory, like a man who was carrying his age. The blue eyes were still sharp, but the rest of him had a weight it didn't usually show, the weight of someone who has constructed a position with great care over many years and is watching a structural member be removed, not by force but by accurate measurement. "That is possible," he said. I did not fully account for the scenarios in which his diminishment would place him in more danger rather than less. I modeled the risk of full expression. I did not model the risk of suppression with equal rigor. Why not? A long pause. Veritaserum long. Because I did not want to. The fracturing was almost audible. "Hermione," in Harry's eye line, had stopped writing. Ron had uncrossed his arms. The Wisengamot panel was consulting in low voices. The student section had the electric stillness of 200 young people who have just been given a real answer to something they'd wondered about for years and are processing what the answer means. Harry testified last, and he did it without Veritaserum. This was his legal right. Primary witnesses in a court's proceedings were not compelled to take Veritaserum, and he decided on it 3 days ago without particular deliberation. He didn't need the drug to tell the truth. He'd been telling the truth since the meadow. He walked to the examination chair and sat in it, and the room oriented toward him with the specific quality of attention it had been building all morning, and he looked at it, all of it, the faces, the panel, Bones, Dumbledore in his chair to the side, and he was not nervous. He was not performing not nervous. He was genuinely, fully present and steady, and the steadiness came from the same place it had come from since the night in the meadow, from having counted all 29, from having looked at the full architecture, from knowing exactly what had been done and exactly what it meant. Bones asked her opening questions and Harry answered them clearly. He described the meadow, Solara's touch, the counting. He described the session in the meadow 2 nights ago and what had been shown to him, and he described it in specific detail, each placement, each maintenance visit, each calibration. The room was very quiet. Then Bones asked, "Mr. Potter, what would you like the panel to understand that testimony so far has not conveyed?" Harry thought about it. He'd prepared for this question and he let the preparation sit and answered from something fresher. "I want them to understand what 40% feels like," he said. "Not the numbers are in the evidence. I want them to understand the experience of it." He paused. "I spent 4 years at this school believing that the gap between what I could do and what I needed to do was a gap in me. My training, my focus, my character. I worked harder to close it and it didn't close, and I told myself that was because I wasn't enough yet. That I needed to be more." He looked at his hands, then back up at the room. "Those 29 workings didn't just suppress my power. They suppressed my understanding of myself. They made me smaller than I was in a way I couldn't see, which meant I couldn't account for it. Every time I made a decision about what I was capable of, I was making it with bad data. Compromised data. Data that had been deliberately compromised by someone who decided they knew better than me what I could handle." He paused. "I'm not asking for sympathy about that. I don't need it. I'm saying it because I want the panel to understand that what was done to me wasn't just about power levels or magical development statistics. It was about the right to know yourself." He looked at Dumbledore. "You said you would make the same decision again. I believe you. I believe you genuinely thought it was right." He held Dumbledore's eyes. "And I want the panel to understand that that makes it more serious, not less. Because a person who acts without knowing they're doing wrong can be corrected. A person who acts knowing it's wrong but believing it's justified, that person will do it again, to the next child who comes along who they decide needs managing for the greater good. Unless something changes the structure that made it possible." He looked at the panel. "That's what I want. Not punishment. A structural change. So that the next Albus Dumbledore, whoever they are, whatever they genuinely believe, cannot do this again. Because the law should be stronger than the most well-intentioned person in the room." The room was completely silent. One of the Wisengamot panel members, an older witch on the left end of the bench, was writing quickly. The one beside her had stopped writing entirely and was just looking at Harry with the expression of someone reassessing something. Bones said, "Thank you, Mr. Potter. Is there anything further?" "One more thing." Harry reached into his robes and took out the 9 pages. He set them on the side table. "Solara, the unicorn matriarch, showed me the placement of each individual curse in sequence. These pages document that sequence, the magical quality of each working, and the timeline of maintenance visits. It is, to the best of my ability to document it, a complete record." He paused. "Hermione Granger has prepared a supplementary analysis, which I'd like submitted to the panel separately. In the student section, Hermione stood up and walked the 23 pages to the front of the room with the composed efficiency of someone who had been waiting to do this exact thing. The panel received both documents. Bones called a recess. Harry sat outside in the corridor during the recess. Ron came and sat beside him and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. After a while Hermione appeared on his other side, and the three of them sat in the stone corridor with the distant sounds of the recess filtering under the door. "How are you feeling?" Hermione asked. "Good," Harry said. "And then, more precisely, ready." "For the verdict?" "For whatever comes next." He leaned his head back against the stone wall. "I said what I needed to say. The rest is up to them." Ron said, "You were brilliant in there." "You were," Hermione agreed, with the directness she reserved for things she genuinely meant without qualification. Harry looked at the corridor ceiling. He thought about the 9 pages in there on the table. He thought about Dumbledore saying I would make it again. He thought about the structural change he'd asked for, not punishment, change, and whether the panel had heard it the way he'd meant it, as something specific rather than something rhetorical. He thought about the tingling in his palms, still there, still constant, the 29 signatures that he'd been carrying for 4 years without knowing they were there and that he was about to, for the first time, know the world without. He thought about 60%. About 80%. About the ceiling, finally, being the actual ceiling. "Ron," he said. "Yeah. When this is over, the trial, the removal, the whole thing, I want a proper Quidditch match. With everyone playing at their full capability and nobody being polite about it." Ron stared at him for a second, and then grinned, the real one, the full one, the one that took up his whole face. "Mate," he said, "you are absolutely going to destroy us." Harry smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I know." Inside the Great Hall, the Wizengamot panel resumed their seats, and Bones called the room back to order, and Harry stood up, and walked back through the door to hear what justice sounded like when it was done correctly. Chapter 5, Accountability. The verdict came at 4 in the afternoon. The Wizengamot panel had deliberated for 3 hours, which Harry had been told was fast for a proceeding of this complexity, and which he'd spent in the corridor with Ron and Hermione and, for a portion of it, Firenze, who'd stood at the window at the end of the hall and watched the unicorn herd on the grounds with the quiet attention of someone receiving information through channels Harry couldn't access. When Bones came to the corridor door and said, "We're ready," she said it looking at Harry specifically, and her voice had the quality it had when she was about to deliver something she believed in. They filed back in. The hall had not changed, still the same configuration, still the same faces, still the students on the benches and the staff in their section and Dumbledore in the chair to the side. But the room felt different in the specific way rooms feel different when a decision has been made inside them. Like the air had been rearranged. The senior panel member, the older witch who'd been writing quickly during Harry's testimony, a woman named Griselda Marchbanks who Harry vaguely recognized from his OWL examinations, stood and read the verdict in the formal language required by the Accords, which was archaic and specific and left no room for interpretation. The panel found Albus Dumbledore in violation of the Magical Being Rights Accords of 1623, Article 14, and the Accords of Naturally Sovereign Magical Species, Article 7, Subsection 3. The finding was unanimous. The violations were characterized as intentional, sustained, and materially harmful, the last point supported by the documented evidence of Harry's suppressed magical development and the risk calculations prepared by Hermione's supplementary analysis. The consequences, read in the same formal language, were these: Dumbledore was to be stripped of his position as headmaster of Hogwarts, effective immediately. He was to be stripped of his position as chief warlock of the Wizengamot, effective immediately. His Order of Merlin, first class, was suspended pending a review of its basis. He was placed under a magical monitoring order for a period of 5 years, requiring quarterly reporting to the DMLE on any magical workings performed within proximity of minors. And he was required, under the direct supervision of the Ministry's curse removal specialist, to participate in the removal of the 29 workings from Harry's magical signature, not as the removal specialist but as a witness, legally compelled to be present while the damage he had done was undone. That last condition had come from Bones directly, Harry learned later. It was not standard procedure. It was Bones's decision, made on the basis that accountability without witness was incomplete. Marchbanks finished reading and sat down. The room was quiet for a long moment. Not shocked, the morning's testimony had prepared the room for a finding of guilt, but absorbing, the way a room absorbs something that has been a long time coming and is now, finally, here. Dumbledore sat in his chair with his hands folded and his face composed into an expression that was not resentment and not defiance but something quieter and more complicated, the expression of a man who has spent 70 years certain he was right and is now holding the possibility that certainty was a comfort rather than a fact. Harry looked at him. He took inventory, the way he'd learned to take inventory since the meadow, and what he found was not triumph and not relief and not the closing of anything. He found something that was almost like sorrow, not for himself but for the waste of it. The waste of all that intelligence and care and genuine power going toward a system of control rather than toward something that could have been better. He let himself feel it, and then he turned to Bones and said, "When do we start the removal?" The answer was, "Tomorrow morning." The Ministry's curse removal specialist arrived that evening, a compact, grave-faced witch named Apollon Voss who'd been practicing curse removal for 22 years and who, upon reviewing Hermione's analysis documents, said nothing for 4 minutes and then said, in a voice completely without drama, "This is going to be a significant piece of work." She met with Harry in the hospital wing while Pomfrey hovered with the professional concern of a healer who had been waiting for 3 days to have something concrete to do. Voss asked Harry questions that Pomfrey hadn't asked, not about the symptoms or the timeline but about how the curses felt. Where in his sense of himself he could most clearly detect them. Whether he had any magical areas that felt more restricted than others, any kinds of magic that had always been notably harder than they logically should have been. Harry thought about it carefully. Transfiguration, always solid. Charms, strong but with a ceiling he'd never been able to account for. Defense, volatile, spiking in emergencies in ways that didn't reflect his controlled performance in class, as if the curses had more difficulty suppressing genuine crisis response than they had suppressing deliberate practice. "My instinctive magic is stronger than my trained magic," he said. "In emergencies I do things I can't replicate in practice." Voss nodded like he'd confirmed something. "The curses target intentional magical expression most effectively. Instinct bypasses the suppression layer partially. That's consistent with the architecture your friend described in her analysis." She looked at her notes. "The oldest 3 curses are going to be the most difficult to remove. They've been there since you were 11, they've integrated into your magical structure the way scar tissue integrates into physical tissue. The removal will feel," she paused, choosing accuracy over comfort, "like the scar tissue being separated. That's the best analogy I can give you." "Will it work?" Harry asked. "Yes. No qualification, no hedge. It will work." "How long will the full removal take?" "For 29 workings of this complexity, staggered over several sessions for safety, 2 weeks minimum. The first session will be the oldest curses, the integrated ones, because the sooner they're separated the better." She put her notes down. "I want to tell you something so you're not surprised by it. When the suppression lifts, even partially, after the first session, you are going to feel your own magic differently than you ever have. It may be disorienting. You may find your magical responses are larger than you expect them to be in ordinary situations. This is normal. It takes time to calibrate to your actual scale." "Calibrate," Harry said. "Like adjusting to a new prescription. Your eyes, your magical instincts, have been working hard to compensate for the distortion. When the distortion is removed, the compensation continues for a while before it adjusts." She looked at him steadily. "You'll be extraordinary, Mr. Potter. You already are, given what you've been working with. What comes after," she stopped, in the way of someone who is making a professional choice not to speculate. "We'll address what comes after when we get there." Harry appreciated the honesty. He said so. She looked mildly surprised. Most patients want reassurance. I want accurate, Harry said. She almost smiled. Tomorrow. 8 a.m. Hospital wing. He told Ron and Hermione that evening in the common room, which was full and warm and loud with the aftermath of the verdict, the day's testimony having spread through the student body in the specific way Hogwarts gossip spread, fast, detailed, surprisingly accurate. People kept looking at Harry in the way they'd been looking at him all day, but the quality of the looking had shifted from the usual mixture of awe and pity to something more singular. He couldn't immediately identify it, and then Hermione said, not looking up from the notes she was reviewing, they're looking at you like they've recalibrated. Like they're seeing the actual size of things, Ron added, from the armchair where he was eating biscuits with the focused satisfaction of someone for whom food and emotional processing were not separate activities. Harry sat on the hearthrug with his back against the sofa and his legs stretched toward the fire. The first session is tomorrow. The oldest 3 curses, the integrated ones. Hermione looked up. Voss explained the process. She said they're like scar tissue. The removal will feel like separating it. He paused. She said it would be painful. Hermione's expression did something careful. How painful? She didn't specify. Do you want us to be there? He thought about it. He'd been thinking about it for most of the evening, in the background, while he ate dinner and talked to people and fielded Neville's careful, earnest expression of support and Ginny's considerably more direct one. He'd thought about the value of witnesses, the value of people who knew him being present, the value of not doing the difficult thing in isolation. Yes, he said. If Voss allows it. And Pomfrey. They'll allow it, Hermione said, with the confidence of someone who intended to make it happen. Ron ate another biscuit. Obviously we'll be there. Harry looked at the fire. I don't know what it's going to be like on the other side of this, he said, which was not something he said often, the admission of a genuine unknown. Voss says the magic will feel different. That I'll need time to calibrate. You'll calibrate, Ron said, with the absolute straightforward certainty he brought to things he was sure of. You might find it a bit overwhelming at first, Hermione said. 60 to 80% suppression releasing, that's, Hermione. Right. Sorry. You'll calibrate, she said, in the tone of someone who agrees with the sentiment while mentally preparing the research anyway. Harry smiled at the fire. Yeah, he said. I will. The morning of the first removal session arrived grey and cold, the kind of October morning that feels like a held breath. Harry ate breakfast without much appetite, not from nerves exactly, but from the particular sensation of standing at the edge of a significant change, the last moments of before. He was in the hospital wing at 8 with Ron and Hermione behind him, and Voss was already there with her case of materials and the specific focused calm of a specialist who does difficult things regularly and has learned that calm is a professional tool, not a personal state. Pomfrey had prepared the bed nearest the window, which got the best light, and had assembled what looked like a small apothecary on the side table, every vial labeled in her precise handwriting. Dumbledore arrived at 8:05. This was the condition, Bones's condition, the accountability witness provision, and he honored it without evasion or complaint. He came in alone, without ceremony, and stood at the back of the room near the door. He was dressed simply. He looked older than he had in the trial, and Harry thought about what 3 days of carrying a unanimous verdict felt like for someone who had spent a lifetime certain of his own judgment. Harry looked at him once. Dumbledore met his eyes with the expression of someone doing the hardest kind of watching, not the watching you choose, but the watching you owe. Harry turned away and climbed onto the examination bed. Mr. Weasley, Miss Granger, Voss said, you may stay, but I need you against that wall and completely silent once I begin. If either of you speaks during an act of working I will stop and reset, which adds 30 minutes and is not pleasant for the patient. Understood? Understood, they said, in unison, and moved to the wall. Voss turned to Harry. I'm going to explain exactly what I'm doing before I do it. I don't believe in surprises during curse removal. She sat in the chair beside the bed and arranged her materials with the methodical care of someone setting up an instrument. The three oldest workings are located deepest in your magical signature, they have the most integration, the most accumulated tissue around them. I'm going to remove them in sequence, oldest first. The removal process for each one takes approximately 10 minutes. I maintain a steady dissolution charm on the working while simultaneously reinforcing the surrounding signature structure so that removal doesn't create a structural gap. She paused. The pain is real. I won't minimize it. But it is not the pain of damage, it is the pain of your magical structure contracting to fill the space the curse occupied, the way a muscle contracts after a cramp releases. It should resolve within minutes of each removal. Should, Harry said. Does, she corrected herself. With appropriate post-session care, which Madame Pomfrey is equipped to provide. Harry lay back. He stared at the ceiling. He was aware of the room around him, Ron and Hermione against the wall, Pomfrey at the side table, Dumbledore at the back, the grey morning light coming through the windows, the sounds of the castle above them settling into its ordinary school day, and he thought, this is the last ordinary moment of the before. Then Voss said, ready, and he said, yes, and it began. The first removal was the worst. Not in the way Harry had expected it to be worst, he'd expected something dramatic, explosive, the magical equivalent of a physical injury. What it was instead was deep. The dissolution charm Voss applied moved through him like something very deliberate and very patient, and when it reached the oldest working, the first one, placed when he was 11 years old and unconscious and 11 years integrated, the contact was like pressing on something that had been numb so long the numbness had become part of the sensation. Then the numbness ended. He didn't make a sound for the first 30 seconds. He held the sides of the bed and breathed through it with the focused steadiness that Quidditch had taught him, not controlling the pain, but staying present inside it, not flying away from the experience but keeping the core of himself in the center of it. Voss's hands were steady. Her wand moved in small, precise patterns. She was talking, quietly, narrating each stage in a low murmur that was clearly as much for her own focus as for his awareness. At 50 seconds he made a sound. At 60 seconds something released. It was not like the cramping Voss had described, that was accurate but insufficient. It was like a room that had always had a low ceiling suddenly having the ceiling lifted, except the room was him, and the sensation of the new space was simultaneously relief and overwhelming because relief on that scale has its own quality of almost too much. His palms went from tingling to blazing to a warmth so complete it felt like the warmth had always been there and the tingling had been the absence of it. His magic moved. He felt it move in a way he had never felt it move, the way you can never feel something move when it's been suppressed so long it forgot it had direction. It moved like water finding its level, not outward in any dramatic external expression, not yet, but inward, filling something that had been empty for 11 years, and the filling felt like the truest thing his body had ever done. One, Voss said quietly. Well done. 2 minutes, then the second. Harry lay on the bed and breathed. His hands on the bed frame were shaking slightly, not from pain but from adjustment, the muscle contraction she described. He looked at the ceiling and the ceiling looked different, same stone, same distance, same gray morning light, but the quality of his awareness of it had shifted, sharpened, the way vision sharpens when a smudge is cleaned from a lens you'd forgotten was smudged. Harry. Hermione's voice, from the wall. Very controlled. You're going to be fine. I know, he said. From the back of the room, near the door, no sound. But Harry was aware of Dumbledore's presence the way he'd been aware of it all his life, the specific weight of it, the particular quality of a powerful old wizard's magical field, and now, with the first working removed, that awareness was sharper too. He could feel the specific frequencies of it. He could feel, in it, the residual trace of the magic that had placed the curse, the same signature Solara had shown him, the same deliberate, dense, academic quality. He looked at the ceiling and he let the awareness be what it was, information. Ready for the second, Voss said. Ready, Harry said. The second was faster because Voss had calibrated to his specific structure in the first, and the second working, while old, was 6 months younger than the first and correspondingly less integrated. It still hurt. The same deep, numb then burning quality, the same contraction, but briefer. When it released he had the same experience of new space, the ceiling lifting again, the magic moving into something larger than it had been 30 minutes ago, and this time he wasn't surprised by it. He let it happen. He didn't try to manage it or direct it or understand it immediately. He just let it fill. Between the second and third, Pomfrey gave him a potion, clear, tasteless, the magical equivalent of an anti-inflammatory. For the structural reinforcement, she said. Voss's charm does most of the work, but this helps the surrounding tissue stay stable. Harry drank it. He lay back down. He looked at the ceiling again. Ron had moved from the wall, not toward Harry. He'd respected Voss's instruction, but he'd shifted forward slightly in the unconscious way that Ron shifted toward things he wanted to be closer to without making it about himself. Hermione had her hand over her mouth in the way she did when she was working very hard not to say several things. Third one, Voss said, and her voice had a different quality, not the professional calm of the first two but a more careful version of it. This is the most integrated. It's also the one placed earliest, and the placement, the original placement, was done with a particular precision that the others weren't. She paused. I want to tell you that I'm going to go slower on this one. The surrounding structure is more complex. If I go too fast there's a risk of what we call sympathetic disruption, a ripple effect through the nearby signature structures. That would not be permanent, but it would be painful and would require several hours of additional work to correct. Slow is fine, Harry said. It's going to be significantly more uncomfortable than the first two. Go ahead. She began. Slow was accurate. She moved the dissolution charm in increments so small that the progress was barely detectable, and for the first 3 minutes the sensation was the same deep numb then warm quality, manageable, present but not overwhelming. Harry breathed through it the way he'd breathed through the first two. Then Voss reached the core of the integration, the place where 11 years of his magical structure had grown around the first curse, the way a tree grows around a fence post, and the curse and his magic had become so intertwined that separating them required the kind of precision that made Harry understand, with genuine respect, why Voss had been doing this for 22 years. The pain arrived without warning, or rather with the specific warning that pain gives by not being gradual. It was simply present, absolute, the kind of deep structure pain that has no surface to press on because it's coming from inside the architecture itself. His hands on the bed frame went white. He heard Hermione make a sharp sound against the wall. He heard Pomfrey's footstep move toward the bed and then stop, because Voss had held up a hand without looking up from her work. Don't interrupt, don't touch, I have this. Harry held the sides of the bed and he breathed. He focused on the warmth in his palms, the two released curses' absence, the space they'd left, and he used that as a reference point, a proof that this was temporary and resolved into something better on the other side, and he stayed in the center of himself and did not go away. Voss murmured, halfway. He held. His magic was doing something strange in the area of the removal, not moving smoothly as it had after the first two but straining, pressing against the boundary of the removal the way water presses against a dam, because 11 years of compressed development was sitting behind this particular blockage and it knew, on some level below thought, that the blockage was almost gone. He held. 3/4, Voss murmured. He held. And then something in his chest went, not broke, not failed, but shifted, the final integrated root of the oldest curse releasing from the structure it had claimed, and the pain peaked and then it crested and then it was over, and the magic moved. It moved the way a wave moves when the wall containing it is finally removed, not explosively outward but inward first, filling every available space with the particular rushing warmth of a thing returning to itself. His hands released the bed frame and his back came off the bed slightly and he made a sound that was not quite pain and not quite anything he could name, the sound of a room expanding from the inside. Every candle in the hospital wing lit simultaneously. Not exploded, lit. Smooth, instantaneous, as if they'd always been lit and had simply been waiting for permission. The windows rattled once, a single note, like a chord struck on a very large instrument. The potions on Pomfrey's side table shimmered in their bottles. And then it settled. Harry lay back against the bed and the warmth in his chest was enormous and quiet and entirely his own, and the tingling in his palms was gone, fully gone, replaced by a clarity of sensation that was the opposite of tingling, the feeling of something so correctly calibrated it had no need to announce itself. The room was very still. "3, Voss said, in a voice that was professionally level and very slightly not. "The 3 oldest are removed." Pomfrey was at his side immediately with 2 potions and her wand running diagnostics and the expression of a woman who was maintaining professional composure through what appeared to be genuine relief. "How do you feel?" Harry considered the question honestly. He felt large. Not physically larger, but the way you feel large when you've been in a small room for a long time and suddenly you're outside. He felt the spaces in himself that the 3 curses had occupied, empty now, filling with something native and warm. He felt the 26 remaining workings more clearly than before, sharper in relief now that the deepest ones were gone, like a thorn is more noticeable when the surrounding tissue has stopped aching. "Good," he said. And then, more precisely, smiling slightly at the ceiling, "Very good." Ron said, from the wall, clearly deciding that the emergency portion was over and normal Ron operations could resume, "Harry, every candle in the room just lit." "I noticed." "That was you?" "I think so." "Mate." Ron's voice had the specific quality of someone recalibrating in real time. "We're going to need a bigger Quidditch pitch." Even Voss almost smiled. The room recovered its ordinary quality in the way that rooms do after significant magical events, gradually, the objects settling, the air returning to its usual density, the candles burning steadily and without drama now that the initial expression had passed. Pomfrey administered the potions, a blue one for structural reinforcement, a clear one for magical fatigue prevention, and ran 3 separate diagnostic scans, each of which produced results that made her expression do things she mostly controlled. Harry sat up carefully. The room tilted slightly and he waited for it to stop tilting, which took about 4 seconds. Then it stopped and he was fine, genuinely fine, the new kind of fine that was different from the fine he'd been saying for 4 years, the fine that was actually true. He looked at Voss. "How does it look?" "Structurally, the remaining 26 are more accessible now that the integrated ones are gone. They were acting as an anchoring layer, the newer workings were keyed to the older ones, and with the older ones removed, the newer ones are floating rather than embedded." She was making notes. "The next session will be considerably less difficult. We can address 8 to 10 curses at a time now." "Good." Harry swung his legs off the bed. Is there a reason to stay in here, or can I, bed rest for the remainder of today?" Pomfrey said firmly. "Madame Pomfrey, not optional." She said it with the specific authority of 30 years and no interest in argument. "Your magical signature has undergone significant structural work today. It needs consolidation time. Tomorrow, assuming the diagnostic is clear, you can go where you like. Today, you rest." Harry looked at her. She looked back with the expression of someone who had not lost a medical argument since 1987 and did not intend to start now. "Fine," he said. "Actual fine, or the other kind?" She said, and there was a sharpness to it that surprised him, a tiny acknowledgement of the morning's conversations, of how much she'd heard and processed today. He almost laughed. "Actual fine," he said. She nodded once, professionally satisfied, and went back to her notes. Harry looked up. Dumbledore was still standing at the back of the room near the door. He'd been there for the entire session, still, silent, watching with the expression that Harry had been reading all morning. Not guilt exactly, which was too simple. Not remorse, which required a change in belief he hadn't fully made. Something that was more like witness. The expression of someone seeing the damage their choices caused, laid out in real time, unambiguous, undeniable, and choosing to keep looking rather than turn away. Their eyes met. Harry said, quietly, and not cruelly, "You can go." Dumbledore held his gaze for a moment. Then, with a gravity that had nothing performed about it, "Harry." He paused. There are things I would say, if you wish to hear them." "Maybe," Harry said. "Not today." A long moment. "No," Dumbledore agreed, quietly. "Not today." He left. The door closed behind him, and the hospital wing was quieter without his presence, the particular quiet of a room that has reorganized its balance of power and found a new configuration more honest than the old one. Ron and Hermione stayed. They sat in the chairs beside Harry's bed, and the afternoon moved through the windows in the particular amber quality of late October, and they talked about nothing important for a while in the way that people who've been through something significant together talk about nothing important, as a recovery, a breathing space, a recalibration of the ordinary. Hermione brought out her notes, which Harry had expected. "The next session removes 8 to 10, Boss said. Assuming the diagnostic is clear tomorrow. At that rate, with appropriate spacing between sessions, the full removal could be complete in 10 to 12 days. She was doing calculations in her head that Harry could see on her face. "Which means by the end of October." "Halloween," Ron said, and then made a face. "Of course it's Halloween." "The timing isn't, it's always Halloween, Hermione." "It's always Halloween with Harry." Harry looked at the window. The afternoon light was doing something specific, hitting the glass and refracting into something fractionally more complex than ordinary light, a quality of depth he wasn't sure had always been there or if he was now seeing it because something in his perception had changed along with everything else. He looked at his hands. They were ordinary hands, nothing different, no visible evidence of the 3 releases. But they felt different, had a quality of readiness that was new, the feeling of hands that finally had access to the full weight behind them. He thought about 26 remaining. He thought about 2 weeks of sessions, the sessions getting progressively less difficult as the integrated ones were gone and the newer ones were addressed. He thought about the end of October and what it would feel like to be at full capacity for the first time. He thought about Voldemort. He thought about that confrontation, the one Dumbledore had arranged his entire containment to postpone, and he thought about it with the new scale of himself, the 3 curses removed and the ceiling that much higher, and he felt something that he'd never quite felt about that particular confrontation before. He'd always felt it as something coming toward him, a threat approaching from outside himself, something he'd have to withstand. Now it felt like something he was moving toward. Not eagerly, not recklessly, but deliberately. On his own terms. At his own scale. Which was, he understood, exactly what Dumbledore had been afraid of. And he thought, he was right to be afraid. But he was wrong about what to do about it. Because the answer wasn't to make the wave smaller. The answer was to make sure the wave knew where to break. At 6 o'clock, as the light failed and Pomfrey began her evening rounds, Firenze appeared in the hospital wing doorway. He came in without ceremony and stood at the foot of Harry's bed and looked at him with the attention of someone checking a reading. "How does she know?" Harry asked. "She knows because she has been attending to your magical signature for 4 years, Firenze said. She felt the 3 releases the moment they occurred. She said," he paused in a listening way, "she said it sounded like a chord resolving." Harry looked at the window. Outside, in the last of the evening light, the herd was still on the grounds. "She's not leaving yet." "No. Not until the full removal is complete. She considers the work ongoing." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Then, what happens to her after? After all 29 are gone? Does she go back into the forest and," he paused, "does she stop paying attention?" Firenze considered this with the careful seriousness he brought to important questions. "She will always carry your signature in her memory. That does not go away." He looked at Harry steadily. "But her attention, the herd-specific vigil, that will end when the work is complete. They are not watchers of people. They are guardians of natural law. When natural law is satisfied, they return to what they are outside of these circumstances. A pause. Which is not less. It is simply different. Harry thought about Solara in the meadow, her 40 years at the edge of the forest, the student she'd carried in her memory, the patience of something that acted because correct was correct and not for any other reason. He thought about the night in the meadow and what she'd shown him, and the fact that she'd shown it to him and not to anyone else, specifically because it was his right to know. "Tell her," he said, "that I don't know yet what I'm going to become. But whatever it is, it's going to be actual. Not managed. Not contained." He paused. "Tell her that's because of her." Firenzo was quiet for a moment, listening to something. Then he said, "She says she knows. She says she's known since the night in the meadow, when you counted all 29 and stood up." Harry leaned his head back against the pillow. Outside the window the last of the daylight was fading, and on the grounds below Solara stood in the growing dark with her horn bright as a compass needle, pointing at nothing in particular, pointing at everything that was true. 26 remaining. The work was ongoing. And for the first time in his life, Harry Potter was doing it at his own scale, in his own direction, with his hands finally open. Chapter 6, The Wizard Who Decided the Last Curse came out on the 31st of October. Ron had called it, which meant Ron got to say "I told you so" approximately 14 times over the course of the morning, and Hermione let him because she was busy being emotional about the occasion in the precise, contained way she was emotional about things, very still, very focused, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes bright. It was the 29th removal. The final one. Voss had worked through them over 12 days in sessions that had progressively shortened as the integrated ones were gone and the newer workings lost their anchoring, the later curses coming away with the relative ease of things that had never fully settled. The 8th session had removed 4 in 40 minutes. The 9th had removed 3 in 25. By the 11th session Harry had started bringing a book, which Voss had found mildly offensive and Pomfrey had found completely characteristic. The 29th curse was different from the others not in its difficulty, it was one of the newer ones, placed in his 4th year, and it came away cleanly, but in what came after. Voss said 29 in the voice she developed for these announcements, quiet and certain and carrying the particular satisfaction of someone finishing a long and precise piece of work. She set her wand down on the side table and sat back and looked at Harry with the expression of someone reviewing a completed project. "That's all of them." Harry was sitting up on the examination bed. He'd stopped lying down for sessions after the 7th, the newer curses hadn't required it and the upright position felt right, felt like the correct physical expression of what was happening. He sat up and he breathed and he felt, himself. Not a version of himself, not the 40% himself, not the managed and calibrated and ceilinged himself. Just himself, all the way to the edges, which were considerably further out than he'd ever known them to be. The feeling was vast in a way that was almost impersonal. Like standing at the edge of a coastline for the first time after a life spent inland, the scale of it was real, was his, but required a moment of just looking before it could be fully inhabited. All the candles lit. They'd started doing this after the 3rd session, spontaneous ignition, involuntary expression of something that was still calibrating to its own size, but today it wasn't just the hospital wing candles. It was every candle in the hospital wing, and the torches in the corridor outside, and Hermione reported later that the torches on the 7th floor had lit themselves at the same moment, which was 4 floors above them and which Pomfrey noted in her medical log under the heading Significant Magical Expression Event with the careful understatement of someone who had decided that clinical language was the appropriate register for something that was actually extraordinary. The windows didn't rattle this time. They hummed, one long note, the stone of the castle conducting something through its bones that was too large for a rattle. Ron, sitting against the wall with his arms crossed and his expression doing the specific thing it did when he was trying very hard not to be overwhelmed and almost managing it, said, "Right. There it is." "There it is," Harry agreed. Voss stayed for the post-session diagnostic and pronounced Harry's magical signature structurally sound, fully integrated, and, she paused here, looking at the scan results with the expression of someone reviewing numbers she'd theoretically expected and is now confronted with the practical reality of, Mr. Potter, your raw magical output at baseline, with the suppressions removed and the natural development pathway restored, is in the top 1% of measured wizards in Britain. Top 1%, Hermione said, in a voice that sounded like she was filing this information in the section of her mind labeled "I knew it, actually." That's the conservative estimate, Voss said. The development that was suppressed doesn't simply resume from where it was stopped, it was occurring in parallel, below the suppression threshold, storing potential. The release of that stored potential over the last 12 days has been, she looked at her notes, substantially larger than I projected. Which is why we've been having the involuntary ignition events. She looked at Harry. Your control will improve with practice. The instincts are already there, they've been working around the suppressions for years, finding workarounds. They just need to learn they don't need the workarounds anymore. How long? Harry asked. Weeks, not months. Your instincts are good. She closed her case with the click of someone completing a professional engagement. I'd recommend structured magical exercise, not formal classes, but intentional, open-ended practice. Let yourself feel the scale of things before you try to direct them. She paused at the door. It has been a genuinely unusual privilege, Mr. Potter. She said it the way precise people say genuine things, plainly, without decoration, so the plainness carries the weight. Thank you, Harry said. For all 12 days. She nodded once and left, and Pomfrey handed Harry a final potion that was golden and warm and tasted like autumn, and said, no extraordinary magical exertion today. Tomorrow you can do whatever you like. Define extraordinary, Harry said. If you have to ask whether it qualifies, it qualifies. She pointed at the door. Go. You've been in this wing enough for 1 month. The castle felt different under his feet. This was not metaphor, it was a literal perceptual shift, the same way the candles had looked different after the first 3 removals but more complete. The stone of Hogwarts, which had always had a quality of aliveness to it, now had it in a register Harry could actually read. He'd always sensed the castle the way you sense a large animal sleeping nearby, aware of the breathing, the weight, the occasional movement, but not understanding the language of it. Now it was like the volume had been turned up and simultaneously the frequency had shifted into a range his new perception could fully access. The castle knew he was walking through it. Not in a threatening way, nothing aggressive, nothing foreign. It was the recognition of something that belonged here, a tuning fork responding to its correct note. He'd been in these corridors for 4 years and the castle had known him in the particular way large old buildings know the people who live inside them, and now there was something additional in that knowing, something that came with the restored scale of himself that was simply, yes, this is where this belongs. Hermione, walking beside him, noticed him trailing his hand along the stone wall and said nothing. Ron, on his other side, also said nothing. This was, Harry thought, one of the better things about the 2 people who knew him best, they let him have his moments of quiet experience without requiring commentary. They walked out through the front doors into the October morning. Solara was there. She was standing at the bottom of the steps, which she'd moved to sometime in the early morning, and the rest of the herd was arrayed behind her with the same configuration they'd held since the night of the verdict, Solara at the front, the others in their loose semicircle, patient and bright in the autumn light. But the quality of the formation had changed. The vigil posture, the particular stillness of creatures holding a position, had shifted into something more like readiness. Like a breath being drawn before speaking. Harry walked down the steps until he was standing 3 feet from Solara, and she looked at him with her gold eyes, and he looked back. The difference was immediate and complete. When he'd first met her gaze, in this same meadow 3 weeks ago, he'd felt the inventory, the careful counting of 29 something's wrong. Now there was no inventory, because there was nothing wrong to count. What she saw when she looked at him now was simply what he was, and what that felt like from the inside was, clean. The cleanness of an accurate mirror after years of a distorted one. She lowered her horn. Slowly. All the way to the ground in a gesture that was unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably formal, unmistakably not anything she had done before in his presence or, Firenze had told him, in anyone's presence in the 4 decades she'd spent at the edge of this forest. Behind him, Harry heard Ron make a very quiet sound. Harry didn't bow, it didn't feel like the right response, didn't feel like what was being asked. What was being asked was something more equal than that. He stepped forward the last 3 feet and put his hand against the side of her neck, palm open, the way he'd learned. What she showed him this time was not the past. It was not the inventory, not the placement sequence, not the history of what had been done. It was, him. Himself, his actual signature, the full uncontained real version, seen from outside by the clearest perceiving instrument he'd ever encountered, and the experience of seeing yourself accurately after a lifetime of distortion was something he had no adequate word for. Not pride. Not relief. Something more foundational than either. The feeling of a true measurement, finally taken. He stood with his hand on her neck for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she lifted her head and took 1 step back, and the herd moved. They didn't leave, not immediately. They moved from their vigil configuration into something looser, more natural, the arrangement of creatures making a decision to go rather than to stay, and there was nothing sad about it and nothing abrupt. It was completion. The logical and correct end of something that had been ongoing and was now finished. Solara held his gaze for one more moment. The gold of her eyes was extraordinary in the morning light, deep and ancient and entirely present, and Harry held it and did not look away. Then she turned. She walked toward the forest with the same impossible precision she'd walked toward him 3 weeks ago, and the herd fell in behind her in their natural order, the younger ones first, the older ones following, their coats catching the autumn sun and throwing it back in the particular way that made them look like they were carrying light rather than reflecting it. At the tree line, Solara stopped. She didn't look back. But she stopped, for exactly 3 seconds, and Harry understood without Firenze's translation what the stop meant. It meant, I have heard you. It means, what you become is your own. It means, we were here. Then she walked into the forest, and the trees closed around the herd, and they were gone. The castle grounds were very still. Ron let out a long breath. Well, he said, in the voice of someone coming up from deep water. That was, yeah, Harry said. She said goodbye. She said we're even, Harry said, and he meant it as the good thing it was. The owl arrived from the ministry at noon. Not Bones's owl, a different one, smaller, official brown, the ministry crest on the seal. Harry opened it at the Gryffindor table during lunch and read it with Ron looking over one shoulder and Hermione over the other. It was from the Department of Magical Education, signed by the interim Hogwarts Oversight Committee that had been established following Dumbledore's removal. The letter informed Harry that Professor McGonagall had been named acting headmistress of Hogwarts, effective immediately, pending a formal appointment process in the spring. It also informed him that the ministry had, in response to the trial findings, commissioned a full review of the magical being rights accords and their enforcement mechanisms, specifically the provisions regarding magical sovereignty of minors in institutional care, and that this review would be chaired by Amelia Bones. Harry read it twice. Then he passed it to Hermione, who read it once and said, "The review is the structural change you asked for." "Part of it," Harry said. "The review leads to updated enforcement." Updated enforcement means the next person who thinks about placing suppression workings on a student has a legal framework specifically designed to stop them. "It won't be perfect," Hermione said, in her honest way. "Reviews become reports and reports become recommendations and recommendations become legislation, and legislation has gaps. Better than nothing." Significantly better than nothing, she agreed, and she sounded like she was already thinking about how to close the gaps. Ron had taken the letter and was reading it. "McGonagall," he said. "McGonagall's headmistress." "Acting," Harry said. "Acting for now," Ron said, with the confidence of someone who'd known Minerva McGonagall for 4 years. "She'll make it permanent inside a term. The school will demand it." He set the letter down. How do you feel about that? Harry thought about McGonagall in the staff room saying my position is with you, and McGonagall on the stairs calling him by his first name, and McGonagall's expression during Dumbledore's Veritaserum testimony when he'd said because I could control it, the look of a woman recalibrating 40 years of trust with the scrupulous honesty she applied to everything. Good, he said. It's very good. He went to see Dumbledore that afternoon. This was his choice, made quietly, without consulting anyone. He'd thought about it for the last 3 days, since the 27th session, when the end was clearly imminent, and he'd arrived at it the way he arrived at decisions that mattered, by sitting with it long enough that the noise fell away and what was left was just whether it was the correct thing to do. It was the correct thing to do. Not for Dumbledore's benefit. For his own. He knocked on the office door, the gargoyle was still there, the fizzing Whisby password still worked, which meant the administrative transition was ongoing and Dumbledore still technically occupied the space until McGonagall moved in, and Dumbledore said, "Come in," in the voice he used when he wasn't arranging his expression first, which was quieter than usual and more tired. The office looked the same and different simultaneously. The instruments were still whirring, the portraits still dozing, the overall quality of accumulated eccentricity still present. But Dumbledore was sitting behind the desk rather than moving through the room in his usual manner, and the quality of his stillness was new, not the stillness of a man at rest but of a man carrying something he hadn't put down yet. Harry sat in the chair across the desk. The one he'd sat in dozens of times, listening to Dumbledore lay out the chessboard of the war, the pieces, the positions, the greater good and its requirements. He sat in it now and looked at the man across the desk and waited. Dumbledore said, "I wasn't certain you'd come." "I wasn't certain either," Harry said honestly. Dumbledore looked at him with the blue eyes that were still, despite everything, the sharpest perceiving instrument in any room. "How do you feel?" "Better than I've ever felt," Harry said, simply and without performance. Something moved through Dumbledore's face at that, not guilt, which Harry had stopped expecting, but something in the vicinity of it. "I watched the third removal," he said. "The first session. I watched you hold the sides of that bed and," he stopped. "I have done a great many things in my life that I believed were right and that I continue to believe were motivated by genuine care. I will not pretend otherwise to you, because you would see through it and because you don't deserve the pretense." He paused. "But I watched the third removal and I understood, in a way that I had not fully understood before, what I had taken from you. Not in the abstract, concretely. The specific experience of watching someone recover something that should never have been taken." Harry listened. "I am not going to tell you I was wrong to care about your survival," Dumbledore said. "I'm not going to tell you the threat wasn't real or the danger wasn't real or that my concern for you was fabricated. It was not." He held Harry's gaze. "I am going to tell you that I was wrong to decide for you. That the decision I made, however genuinely motivated, was not mine to make. And that in making it I treated you as a means to an end that I valued more than I valued your right to yourself. And that," he paused, and what came through was genuine, was the Veritaserum honest version of something the composed public man very rarely showed, "that is not who I wanted to be." Harry sat with that for a moment. "I believe you," he said. Dumbledore looked at him with something that might have been surprise. "I believe you didn't want to be that person," Harry said. "I believe you genuinely thought you were doing the right thing. I believe the care was real." He paused. "I also believe that none of that changes what happened, or means that it should have been allowed to continue, or means the verdict was wrong." He kept his voice level and clear. "You're a brilliant wizard, Dumbledore. You're probably the most politically and magically powerful person in Britain. And you spent decades using all of that to decide for other people what they were capable of handling. Not just me." He let that land. "That's not going to work anymore. The review bones is running, the enforcement updates, those are going to create mechanisms that stop this from happening to the next student. The next Harry Potter, whoever they are, is going to have protections that I didn't have." Dumbledore was very quiet. "That's what the trial was for," Harry said. Not you specifically. The structure. He stood up. I don't know yet if I forgive you. That's an honest answer. I'm not ready to say it and mean it, and I'm not going to say it before I mean it. He paused at the door. But I came here because I wanted you to hear directly from me. I'm all right. I'm better than all right. Whatever you were trying to protect by doing what you did, I'm going to be fine. He put his hand on the door. More than fine, he said quietly. For the first time. He walked out of the office and down the spiral staircase and through the corridor, and he didn't look back, because looking back was for people who weren't sure of the direction they were moving in. Harry was sure. The room of requirement opened for him that evening without his having a fully formed request. He'd walked past the 7th floor corridor with the vague intention of thinking, and the door had appeared, which meant the castle had a better read on what he needed than he'd consciously articulated. He went in. The room was large and plain. Stone floor, high ceiling, the actual ceiling this time, properly high, with room to breathe, and a single window that showed the October evening, the grounds dark below and the stars visible above. No furniture, no objects, just space. Harry stood in the center of it. He'd been thinking all day about what Voss had said, let yourself feel the scale of things before you try to direct them. He'd been careful since the removals began, instinctively measured in his magical use in the way that someone who has spent years working around constraints is careful when the constraints first come off. Compensating for a compensation. He'd been operating with the same careful precision as before, just from a larger starting point, and the precision was correct, but the precision wasn't the whole picture. He needed to feel the whole picture. He raised his hand. No wand. He'd put his wand in his pocket because what he wanted to feel was not the direction that a wand provided but the thing beneath the direction, the raw fact of what he was now. His magic moved. It moved the way the removals had felt, wave-like, filling available space, but outward this time, expressed rather than reclaimed, and the scale of it was new and extraordinary and entirely natural, the way breathing deeply is natural, the way your stride is natural when you stop trying to make it shorter. He felt it reach the walls of the room and the room expanded, the castle accommodating him the way it had been accommodating students for 1,000 years, the way it had always accommodated him but could now do so at his full scale. The window showed the stars. He looked at them and thought, this is what I am. Not a threat, not a weapon, not a managed asset, not the boy who survived. This is the actual fact of myself. He stood in the room of requirement on Halloween evening and he felt, for the first time, like someone who had decided to exist rather than someone existence kept happening to. He stayed there for an hour. He didn't do anything dramatic. He just stood in the large, plain room and breathed and let the magic be what it was, and when he left he felt different than when he'd entered in a specific way that people feel different after they've spent time with something true. Ron and Hermione were waiting in the common room. Not waiting like they'd been sent to wait, waiting like they'd been there and hadn't gone to bed because they wanted to see him when he came back. Ron was playing chess against himself and losing both sides with equal commitment. Hermione had a book but wasn't reading it, which was the tell. Harry sat in the armchair by the fire and Ron looked up and Hermione put the book down and the three of them sat in the warmth of the Gryffindor common room on Halloween night and were quiet together in the comfortable way. After a while, Ron said, "Good evening." "Yeah," Harry said. "Really good. Room of requirement?" "Yeah." Ron nodded. "How did that feel?" Harry considered. "Like the first time I got on a broom," he said. "That specific thing of, oh. This is what I'm for." Ron smiled. Hermione's expression was the quietly pleased kind that she reserved for things that confirmed something she'd believed for a long time. "Speaking of broomsticks," Ron said, in the tone of someone segueing without apology, "Gryffindor has practice Saturday morning. And I know Pomfrey said no extraordinary magical exertion today, but she said nothing about Saturday. And I have been thinking," he paused for effect, which with Ron was always brief because Ron didn't have a theatrical temperament, "that the Slytherin match is in 3 weeks and we have never in 4 years played with Harry Potter at full capacity, and I would genuinely like to see what that looks like. You're his keeper, Hermione said. You realize you're essentially volunteering to be scored on repeatedly. I'm volunteering to play against something extraordinary, Ron said. The scoring is a side effect. He looked at Harry. Saturday? Harry grinned. Saturday. McGonagall called him to her office the following morning. Her office, Dumbledore's office, which was already becoming McGonagall's office in the particular way that spaces take on the quality of their occupants rapidly when the occupant is strong-charactered, the portraits already sitting up straighter. She was behind the desk with the practical efficiency of someone who had been running the school functionally for years and was now simply doing it with the title attached. She looked up when he came in and gestured to the chair. Sit down, Harry. He sat. She looked at him for a moment with the evaluative expression of someone checking a reading. Whatever she found in the reading satisfied her, because she nodded once. You look well, she said. I feel well. Good. She folded her hands on the desk. I'm going to tell you some things directly, because I have found over 4 years that you respond better to directness than to the alternative, and because I respect you enough to offer it. She paused. Dumbledore is leaving Hogwarts at the end of the week. He is moving to his brother's home in Godric's Hollow. He has not said he is done with the war. I don't believe he is done with the war. But his role in it, from this point, will not involve decisions made about you without your knowledge. The DMLE monitoring order will ensure that. I know, Harry said. I want to discuss your defense curriculum for the remainder of the year. She opened a folder. Your practical defense scores, when mapped against what we now know about your suppressed development, suggest that your actual capability in this area has been, substantially underassessed. I've spoken with Professor Shacklebolt, who has agreed to take on additional tutorial sessions specifically designed to help you develop full practical fluency at your actual level. Shacklebolt. Harry thought about the aura, serious, skilled, the kind of practical magical ability that came from years of real-world application rather than institutional setting. That works, he said. Additionally, McGonagall continued, I want to address the question of the war. She said it plainly, without the careful avoidance that most adults used when the subject came up with Harry, the instinctive reach for euphemism and redirection. Voldemort's return is confirmed. The Ministry's public position remains, ill-advised. Bones is working on that, but it will take time. She looked at him steadily. You are 15 years old and you are at the center of this conflict whether anyone planned it or not. I am not going to pretend otherwise or try to manage that reality. What I am going to do is make sure that every resource this school has is available to you, and that you are trained and prepared and supported in the genuine sense of those words, not in the sense of being managed towards someone else's preferred outcome. She said it with the absolute finality of someone who had learned the distinction the hard way and had no intention of making that mistake again. Thank you, Harry said. He meant it in the full sense. For all of it. Not just this, all of it. The staff room. The trial. Coming forward with McGonagall's position rather than, there was no other position available to me, she said, with the brisk certainty of someone closing off gratitude they find unnecessary. Don't thank me for being correct. A pause, and the briskness softened by 1 degree. Though I will say, I am very glad you told me. In the corridor, that morning. I'm glad you trusted me with the full version. You asked for it, Harry said. Not everyone who asks for the full version actually wants it, she said. You gave it to me because you judged that I could be trusted with it. I take that seriously. He looked at her, this woman who'd been his head of house for 4 years, who'd called him Harry once in first year and kept the formality as a kind of respect, who'd spent 37 years loyal to a man she was now quietly, irrevocably, professionally done with, not out of anger but out of the recalibrated clarity of someone who applies the same standards to everything and finds nothing exempt. She was, he thought, one of the most genuinely good people he knew. Not in the uncomplicated way, not in the way that avoided difficulty, good in the way that made the difficult decisions because they were correct and lived with the cost of them. Minerva, he said, deliberately, and she looked slightly startled, and then the startlement became something warmer. Harry, she said, in the same register. I think this school is going to be all right, he said. She held his gaze. I think so too, she said, with the careful precision of someone who believes something and is choosing, for once, to just say it. Saturday morning. The Quidditch pitch was cold and bright, the kind of autumn morning that feels like it was made for being outside, all sharp air and clean light and a sky that was simply and completely blue. Harry stood at the edge of the pitch with his Nimbus 2000, he needed a better broom, that was a thought for next week, and felt the morning. The Gryffindor team was assembled, and they were looking at him with the particular quality of attention that the last 2 weeks had produced in people who knew him and had processed, in their various ways, what had changed. Katie Bell had the expression of someone professionally reconsidering her assessment of her seeker. Alicia Spinnet was trying to be casual about it and succeeding approximately 40% of the way. Fred and George were grinning with the specific delight of people who had a strong suspicion about what was coming and were looking forward to being right about it. Ron was at the goalposts, broomstick in hand, wearing the expression of someone who had made a decision and was comfortable with the consequences of it. Harry mounted the broom. He kicked off. The morning air hit him and the broom responded and he went up, not at his usual measured initial climb, the habitual care of someone who'd spent years operating within invisible limits, but straight up, full, the way the altitude wanted to be covered, and the speed was different. It was not faster in the way that better technique is faster. It was faster in the way that having the full weight of yourself behind everything is different from 40% of it, and he felt it immediately and completely and it was exactly what he'd known it would be, a revelation wearing the shape of something familiar. He leveled off above the pitch and hung in the air for 1 second. Then he flew. He flew the way the speed asked to be flown, not showing off, not performing, just operating at his actual scale for the first time in his life on a broom, and the pitch below him was small and the sky above him was enormous and the clarity of the morning air at speed was something he'd felt before but never like this, never with the full weight of himself behind it. He banked, he climbed, he dropped in a half dive that he pulled out of at the last possible second not because of the risk but because it felt correct to test the limit from the inside. Below him, Fred said something to George, and he could hear it even from the altitude, which told him something about what his sensory awareness had become. I told you. You absolutely told me, George agreed. Ron, at the goalposts, was watching with his arms crossed and his expression open and something in his eyes that was simply pride. Not complicated pride, not the kind that came with caveats or qualification. Just, that's my friend and look at him. Harry dove toward the pitch and pulled up and hovered and looked at his team. Right, he said. Let's practice. The letter from Sirius arrived that evening, delivered by a small and extremely self-important owl that deposited it on the dinner table with the air of someone who had carried something important and wanted credit for it. Harry opened it. Sirius's handwriting was dramatic and slightly uneven in the way of people who'd spent 12 years in Azkaban and whose relationship with the fine motor skills of correspondence had never fully recovered. Harry, heard from Remus about the trial. All of it. I've been in this house for 2 months trying not to tear the walls off and then I read Remus's letter and sat down very suddenly and then I read it again. I don't know what to say about Dumbledore that isn't going to sound like 12 years of personal grievance talking, so I'll say this instead. I'm glad it happened the way it happened. I'm glad it was public and I'm glad it was clean and I'm glad you stood up in that room and asked for a structural change instead of just a consequence. That's James, but it's also you. It's more you than James, actually. I want to see you. Christmas, if you can manage it. I want to see what you look like now. I love you. I'm proud of you. Don't let anyone tell you what size you're supposed to be. Sirius. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket, next to where the 9 pages had been, and he sat at the dinner table with Ron and Hermione and the warm noise of the great hall around him and let the letter sit in his chest next to everything else that had found its right place there in the last 3 weeks. Hermione said, without looking up from her food, "Good letter." "Very good letter," Harry said. "Serious?" "Yeah. Ron glanced over. Is he all right? He's serious, Harry said. He's always either catastrophically not all right or completely fine. Tonight sounds like fine. Ron nodded and went back to his food. Hermione smiled at her plate. Outside the Great Hall's enchanted ceiling, the Halloween stars were out, clear and cold and very far away and very present simultaneously, the way stars are, the way true things are, the way the scale of yourself is when you finally stop looking at it through a distortion and just look at it. Harry Potter was 15 years old and he was sitting at dinner on Halloween in the school he'd come to at 11 not knowing what he was, and he knew now. Not everything, not the prophecy's full shape, not the war's full length, not what he would be required to do or survive or choose. But the foundational thing. The thing underneath the roles and the expectations and the management and the greater good and the survival. Who he was. His own scale. His own direction. His own ceiling, which was the actual one, which was as high as it needed to be. The plates were cleared. The candles burned. The castle breathed around him, warm and enormous and alive, and when Harry stood up from the table and walked out of the great hall into the corridor, his footsteps on the stone were steady and even and entirely unhurried, the footsteps of someone who had somewhere to be and knew exactly how to get there. Not the boy who survived. The wizard who decided.